Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. This also keeps you updated with new episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I rented a small cabin in the woods for a week, hoping to get away from the city and all the noise. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, just me and my thoughts. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by thick trees, with no neighbors for miles. At first, it was exactly what I needed. Quiet, simple, just nature. But then things started to get weird. The first evening, as the sun was setting, I was sitting on the porch with a beer in hand, watching the woods. That's when I noticed him. There was a man standing at the edge of the trees, just watching me. He wasn't moving, just staring. He had on a plaid shirt, dirty jeans, and a weathered face. I didn't think too much of it at first. Figured he might just be some local wandering around, so I waved. He didn't wave back. He just turned and walked into the trees. The next evening, around the same time, I saw him again. Same spot, same clothes. He stood there for longer this time, watching me, not moving. It was starting to feel strange. I waved again, trying to be friendly, but he didn't respond. He just disappeared back into the trees after a while. I felt uneasy but told myself it was nothing. The third evening, I saw him again. He was closer this time, just past the tree line. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. I stood up and called out, asking if he needed anything, but he didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching me like before. Something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. He looked like he belonged in the woods, like part of the forest itself, rough and worn down. When he turned to leave, I watched until he was out of sight. The next day, I decided to confront him if I saw him again. It wasn't sitting right with me, this guy just lurking around every evening. That night, as expected, he showed up again, standing even closer this time. I could see the lines on his face, the way his eyes seemed hollow in the fading light. I marched over to the edge of the property, keeping my distance but close enough to talk. "Hey," I said, my voice firm, "is there something you need? Why do you keep coming here?" He stared at me for a long moment before shaking his head slowly. "Ain't been here before," he muttered, his voice low and raspy. Then he turned and walked off again, disappearing into the woods. His words stuck with me. He'd definitely been there before. I'd seen him 3 nights in a row. Was he lying? Maybe he was messing with me. I didn't know, but the whole thing was starting to freak me out. I locked the cabin door that night, something I hadn't done before. The next evening, I didn't go outside. I stayed inside the cabin, peeking out through the window. Sure enough, as the sun started to set, he appeared again. This time he was standing right at the edge of the porch. He was closer than ever, just staring at the cabin. I stayed hidden, heart pounding in my chest, watching in through the small crack in the curtains. He didn't move for what felt like hours. Then, just like before, he turned and walked away into the woods. The following morning, I decided I had enough. I wasn't going to stay here for the full week. It was getting too weird. I called the rental agency and told them about the guy. They said no one lived nearby and that it was unusual for anyone to be on the property. They offered to send someone out to check, but I declined. I didn't want to make a big deal of it, and I was planning on leaving early anyway. That evening, I was packing my bags when I heard something outside. I looked through the window and there he was, standing in the same spot as before. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were 2 more men with him, standing just behind him in the shadows. They were all staring at the cabin. Panic set in. I grabbed my keys and my bag, ready to leave right then and there. But as I stepped outside, they were gone. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but there was no one in sight. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there, watching. I could feel it. My heart was racing as I got into the car and started the engine. As I drove down the narrow road leading away from the cabin, I kept checking my rearview mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The road was empty, but every now and then, I thought I saw movement in the trees, like shadows darting between the trunks. I made it to the nearest town and checked into a small motel for the night. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. It felt too strange to explain. I didn't even know what to say. Who were those men? Why were they watching me? The next morning, I drove back to the cabin to grab the rest of my things. I was nervous, but I figured it would be safe in the daylight. When I arrived, the cabin looked just as I had left it, but there was something new. There were markings on the windows, strange symbols scratched into the glass. They hadn't been there before. I didn't stay to investigate. I grabbed my remaining stuff, locked up, and left for good. I told the rental agency what I had seen, but they didn't seem too concerned. They said no one else had reported anything unusual. It was like they didn't believe me. I don't know who those men were or what they wanted, but I've never felt so watched, so vulnerable. I arrived at the house in the late afternoon. The drive had been long, and I was looking forward to just relaxing. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, and the photos of the Airbnb looked perfect, cozy, isolated, and close to nature. I parked in the gravel driveway and got out, stretching my legs. The house was old, but well kept, a two-story cottage with a white picket fence. I found the key under the mat, just like the host had said, and let myself inside. The place smelled a little musty, but I figured that was normal for a house in the woods. It was clean, though, and everything seemed to be in order. I dropped my bag near the door and took a look around. The furniture looked just like the photos, though some of it seemed a bit older than I expected. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a staircase leading upstairs to what I assumed were the bedrooms. It had that lived-in feeling, which was comforting in a way. After unpacking a bit, I noticed a few things that seemed off. The first thing was a framed photo on the mantel above the fireplace. It was an old family portrait, a man, a woman, and 2 children. I didn't think much of it at first, but something about it nagged at me. The Airbnb listing hadn't mentioned anything about a family living here recently. The place was supposed to be used just for rentals, but this picture made it seem like someone still lived here. I shrugged it off and went to the kitchen to make some tea. That's when I noticed the second odd thing. There were dishes in the sink. Not just a couple, but a stack of them. They were clean, but they definitely hadn't been put away. Again, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe the cleaners just forgot to finish the job. I'd send a message to the host later. As the evening wore on, I settled in with a book and tried to relax. But there was a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. I decided to check my email to see if the host had left any last-minute instructions. That's when I saw it, a message from the Airbnb host, sent just an hour ago. "Hi, just confirming your stay. You should have arrived by now. If you have any issues, let me know. I won't be available tonight after 9 p.m., but feel free to reach out before then." I stared at the screen. The message didn't match up with the check-in instructions I had received before. I hadn't spoken to the host since booking the place a few weeks ago. I looked back at the listing details to compare, and that's when I noticed something strange. The address on the listing didn't match the one I was at. It was close, just a few numbers off, but enough to make me realize I was in the wrong place. Panic started to set in. I had been here for hours, thinking this was the right house. But whose house was this? I quickly grabbed my phone and called the number the host had provided, but it went straight to voicemail. I hung up and tried again, my hands shaking. Still no answer. I looked around the room, the family photos suddenly feeling much more ominous. The realization that I was in someone else's home hit me hard. I thought about leaving right then, but it was already dark outside, and the house was in the middle of nowhere. I didn't even know where the real Airbnb was. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that it was just an honest mistake that I could explain if anyone showed up. But then I heard a car pulling into the driveway. My heart stopped. I crept to the window and peeked out, seeing headlights cutting through the trees. The car was old, a beat-up sedan, and it parked right behind mine, blocking me in. The engine cut off, and I saw two people inside, a man and a woman. They sat there for a moment, talking, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. Then the man got out, his silhouette dark against the porch light. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Should I hide? Try to explain? My stomach twisted with fear as I heard the front door handle rattle. The door didn't open, though it was still locked. But then I heard keys jingling, and I realized with horror that they had their own set. They were the owners. I ran upstairs, my footsteps quiet, hoping they wouldn't hear. I didn't know what to do. I could hear the door open now, their voices low as they stepped inside. The woman said something I couldn't make out, but her tone wasn't happy. I ducked into the first bedroom I found, closing the door softly behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest. I could hear them moving around downstairs, talking, but I couldn't make out the words. The tension in the air was suffocating. What would they do when they realized a stranger had been in their house? I tried to think of an excuse, something that would make sense, but nothing sounded believable. How could I explain being in someone's home by mistake for hours? The footsteps grew louder as they moved closer to the stairs. I knew they would come up soon, and when they did, they would find me. My mind raced. Maybe I could sneak out, get to my car and leave before they saw me. I cracked the bedroom door open and peeked out. The hallway was empty, but I could hear them coming up the stairs now. My pulse quickened. I moved as quietly as I could, slipping out of the room and heading toward the back of the house. There was a window at the end of the hall, and I prayed it wasn't locked. I reached the window just as the man stepped onto the landing. His voice was calm, too calm. "Hello," he called out, his tone chilling. I froze for a second, but then I forced myself to move. I fumbled with the window latch, my hands shaking. The woman's voice followed, asking him something in a low tone. I pushed the window open just as I heard footsteps heading down the hall. They were coming straight for me. Without thinking, I climbed out the window, dropping to the ground below. I landed hard, pain shooting up my legs, but I didn't stop. I ran around the side of the house, my heart pounding in my ears. I could still hear them inside, but they hadn't seen me yet. I reached my car and yanked the door open, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I threw it into reverse, backing out of the driveway as fast as I could. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man standing on the porch, watching me with a cold, unreadable expression. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, shaking all over. I parked at a gas station and just sat there for a while, trying to calm down. I never went back to that house. I rented a cabin out by a lake last fall, thinking it would be a quiet getaway. The place was small, just one room with a bed and a kitchenette. It was nothing fancy, but that was the point. I needed the quiet, the space to think, to just be away from everything for a bit. The lake was completely still, and there were only a few other cabins nearby, scattered around the water. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent the days hiking around the area, reading, just trying to clear my head. There was another cabin across the lake from mine, probably a couple 100 yards away. It looked abandoned, overgrown, shutters hanging loose, the dock falling apart. I didn't think much of it. On the third night, I noticed a light flickering over there. It caught my eye as I was sitting on the porch, watching the sun go down. It wasn't like someone had turned on a lamp or anything. It was more like a flashlight, maybe, or a candle, just blinking on and off. It was strange because I hadn't seen anyone there since I arrived, and the place didn't look like it was in any shape to be lived in. I told myself it was probably just some kids messing around. I had no reason to think otherwise, but still, something about it made me uneasy. The light would flicker for a while, then go out completely, only to come back a few minutes later. It kept doing that, on and off, until I finally went inside for the night. The next day, I walked around the lake, figuring I'd go check it out. I wasn't scared, just curious. The path was overgrown, but I found my way to the other side easily enough. The closer I got to the cabin, the more rundown it looked. The roof had caved in on one side, and there were weeds growing up through the cracks in the porch. When I got up to the front door, I noticed it was slightly open. Not much, just a crack, but enough to make me pause. I thought about turning around right then, but I didn't. Instead, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The place was a mess. Furniture was overturned, the floor covered in dust and leaves that had blown in through broken windows. But what caught my attention was the table in the center of the room. It was clear, no dust, no debris. Someone had been here recently. I walked over to it, and that's when I saw the candle. It was burned down to almost nothing, the wax pulled on the table. It wasn't an old candle, either. It had been used recently, probably the night before. Next to it was a pack of matches, one of them still half burned. I stood there for a minute, trying to make sense of it. There was no sign of anyone living here, no food, no clothes, nothing to suggest someone had been staying here. Just that candle and the matches. I stepped back outside, feeling more unsettled than I wanted to admit. As I stood on the porch, I looked back at my own cabin across the lake. It was so quiet, so still, and for a moment, I felt completely alone, even though I knew there were other people in the area. That light flickering all night suddenly felt a lot more sinister. I headed back to my cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, though there was no one. That night, the light across the lake flickered again, just like before. This time, I watched it longer. The pattern was strange, almost deliberate. It wasn't random, like a faulty light or someone casually moving around. It blinked on and off in short bursts, like someone signaling something. I tried to convince myself it was just some local kids, or maybe even a reflection from something else, but deep down, I didn't believe that. Something about it felt too deliberate. The next day, I debated going back, but I couldn't bring myself to. I spent the day in my cabin, but I couldn't focus on anything. My eyes kept drifting to that cabin across the water. The flickering didn't start again until the sun went down, but when it did, it felt even more eerie. Like it was waiting for me to notice. I decided to stay inside that night, but I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that light flashing in the darkness. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy, like I'd been watched all night. I knew it was just in my head, but it didn't make the feeling go away. I made some coffee and sat on the porch, trying to shake off the tension. That's when I saw the footprints. They were on the edge of the lake, right near the water. They hadn't been there the day before, and they weren't mine. Someone had walked around the lake, right up to the water's edge, and stood there. Watching, maybe. I got up and walked closer to the water. The prints were clear, leading from the woods down to the shore, then stopping. Whoever had been there hadn't crossed the lake, but they had stood there for a while, looking across at my cabin. I felt sick to my stomach. That night, the light didn't flicker. The cabin across the lake was dark, but that didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it made me feel worse, like something was building, waiting. I kept the curtains closed, but I couldn't stop myself from peeking out every few minutes, half expecting to see someone standing outside. The hours dragged on, and every little sound made me jump. The creak of the wind, the rustle of leaves, all of it set my nerves on edge. Then, just after midnight, I heard something, a knock on the door. It was quiet, almost hesitant, but it was definitely a knock. My heart started racing. I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen, listening. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. There was no one there. I waited, my hand on the doorknob, unsure of what to do. The knock came a third time, and this time it was hard, demanding. I stepped back, my mind racing. Whoever was out there wanted me to open the door, but I wasn't going to. I sat down in the dark, my back against the wall, and waited. The knocking stopped after a few minutes, but the tension didn't. I stayed awake all night, listening for any sound, but nothing happened. In the morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't care about the rest of my reservation. I wasn't going to stay there another night. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin across the lake one last time. The shutters were closed, the dock empty, but I could have sworn I saw someone standing in the window, watching me leave. I rented a small cabin in the woods for a weekend. It was far from anything, just the way I wanted. I needed time away, to relax, to not think about work or life for a few days. The place was isolated, miles from the nearest town. It had this old, worn charm about it, tucked away behind thick trees. There was no cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just me and the quiet. The first day was peaceful. I spent most of it outside, sitting on the porch, listening to the birds, the wind through the trees. In the evening, I built a fire in the little stove and read by the light of an old lamp. It felt good to be away from everything. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The second day, just before noon, a man came by. He knocked on the door, and I was surprised because I hadn't seen anyone around since I arrived. He introduced himself as Tom, said he lived about a mile down the road. He seemed friendly enough, maybe a little too friendly, but I didn't think much of it at first. He told me he noticed someone new at the cabin and just wanted to check in, make sure I was settling in all right. We chatted for a few minutes. He asked if I needed anything, offered to show me around the area. I thanked him but said I was just here to relax. He smiled, said he understood, then left. I thought that would be the end of it. That evening, just as it was getting dark, there was another knock at the door. It was Tom again. This time, he had a flashlight in his hand and said he was just passing by, making sure I was okay. It felt a little odd, but I didn't want to be rude. He stood on the porch for a few minutes, asking me how my day was, if I'd seen any wildlife. His questions felt more like small talk than anything else, but there was something about the way he lingered that made me uneasy. He asked if I had locked all the doors and windows, said it was a good idea out here. I told him I had, but he kept insisting I double-check. He offered to walk around the cabin with me, make sure everything was secure. I politely declined, told him I could handle it. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He stayed a few minutes longer than he should have, then finally left. That night, I couldn't sleep as well. Every little sound outside made me sit up and listen. I kept thinking about the way Tom had stood there, just a little too close, his eyes watching me like he wasn't really listening to what I was saying. The next day, I stayed inside more. I didn't feel like going out, and I kept glancing at the road, half expecting to see him walking up again. By afternoon, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just being neighborly, a little too eager to help. It wasn't until late that night that I realized how wrong I was. It was past 10 when I heard the knock. I froze for a second, my heart racing. I knew it was him. I didn't want to answer, but I felt like I had to. When I opened the door, there he was, smiling again, holding that same flashlight. He said he noticed the lights on and wanted to make sure I was okay. I lied and said I was just about to go to bed, hoping he'd take the hint. Instead, he asked if he could come in for a minute. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want him inside, but I also didn't want to make him angry. Reluctantly, I stepped aside and let him in. He walked around the cabin, commenting on how cozy it was, how it reminded him of his own place. He looked at everything, like he was inspecting it. Then he asked again if I'd checked all the locks. I told him I had, but he walked over to the back door and tried the knob, like he didn't believe me. I was starting to feel trapped. I didn't know how to get him to leave without making things worse. He kept finding reasons to stay, asking questions about my trip, offering tips about the area. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. He wasn't just being friendly anymore, he was testing me, pushing to see how far he could go. Finally, I told him I was tired and needed to sleep. He hesitated for a moment, then smiled that same strange smile and said good night. I locked the door behind him and listened as his footsteps faded down the path. But I couldn't relax. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't really gone. I checked the locks again, every window, every door. I even pulled a chair in front of the door, just in case. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't help it. Something about him just wasn't right. The next morning, I woke up early, anxious to leave. I packed my things quickly, ready to get out of there before Tom showed up again. But just as I was about to load my bags into the car, I saw him coming up the road. My heart sank. He waved and called out, saying he brought some breakfast. I forced a smile, trying to act like I wasn't in a rush. He walked up, holding a paper bag, and asked if I'd like to sit and eat with him. I told him I couldn't, that I had to leave. I hoped he'd understand, but his smile faded, and he just stood there, staring at me for a second. Then, almost too casually, he asked why I was leaving so soon. I stammered something about needing to get back for work, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He kept standing there, blocking my way to the car, like he was waiting for me to change my mind. I felt trapped again, like I had no way out. I forced another smile and told him I appreciated his hospitality, but I really had to go. He finally stepped aside, but I could feel his eyes on me as I loaded my bags into the car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, watching me, his face unreadable. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that cabin, from those woods, from him. Even then, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see his truck following me down the road. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Something about him, the way he kept coming back, the way he pushed his way into my space, it wasn't right. I woke up in the middle of the night, not really sure what had disturbed me at first. I sat up in bed and listened for a while, thinking maybe it was just the wind or some animal outside. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, right on the porch. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I live alone in a small house out in the country, so hearing something like that isn't normal. The nearest neighbor is half a mile away, and nobody just comes by this time of night. I lay there for a few seconds, frozen, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just an animal. But animals don't walk like that. They don't take slow, careful steps, like someone trying not to be noticed. I grabbed the baseball bat I keep by the bed and crept toward the front door. The sound had stopped by the time I got close, so I took a deep breath and opened the door a crack, just enough to peek out. The porch light flickered dimly, but there was no one there. I stepped outside, looking around the yard. Nothing. The grass was still, and the night was silent, too silent. I stood there for a while, straining my ears for any sign of movement, but all I heard was my own heartbeat. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat on the couch for a long time, too jittery to go back to bed. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The day passed without incident. I went about my usual routine, trying to forget about what had happened the night before. I convinced myself that maybe it had been a stray dog or something, even though I knew that wasn't true. As night fell again, though, the unease started creeping back in. I didn't sleep much that night, just laid in bed, listening for any noise. And sure enough, sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer. It sounded like they were right up against the front door. I sat up in bed, gripping the bat so tightly my hands hurt. I waited, listening to the sound of someone or something pacing back and forth on the porch. The steps were heavier this time, more confident, as if whoever it was knew I was awake and listening. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't dare move. After what felt like forever, the footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, straining to hear any movement. But there was nothing, just silence again. I stayed up the rest of the night, too afraid to go outside, too afraid to even look out the window. This became a pattern over the next few nights. I'd go to bed, try to sleep, and then, in the dead of night, the footsteps would return. Each time, they got closer, bolder. They lingered longer. Whoever it was never knocked, never tried to get in, just paced outside like they were waiting for something. By the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I was going to confront whoever it was. I stayed up, sitting by the front door with the bat in my lap, waiting. When the footsteps started, I jumped up and threw open the door. There was no one there. The porch was empty, just like before. But I knew I'd heard something. The sound of footsteps had been so clear, right on the other side of the door. My skin crawled. I stepped out onto the porch again, looking around the yard, the woods surrounding the house. It was dark, too dark. The moon barely lit anything, and the shadows seemed to stretch out forever. I went back inside, locked the door, and pushed a chair up against it. I sat there the rest of the night, not moving, barely blinking. The footsteps didn't come back that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. The next day, I called the local sheriff's office. I told them what had been happening, but they didn't seem too concerned. Probably just some kids messing around, they said. They promised to send someone out to patrol the area, but that didn't make me feel any better. That night, I tried to stay calm, tried to tell myself it was all in my head. But I couldn't sleep, not really. I kept listening, waiting for the footsteps to start again. And they did. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They circled the house, slowly, methodically. I could hear them moving from the front door to the windows, stopping just long enough for me to imagine someone standing there, peering in. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to go away. But it didn't. It went on for hours. I don't know how I made it through that night, but when the first light of dawn broke through the curtains, the footsteps finally stopped. I knew I couldn't stay in the house another night. I packed a bag, planning to leave for a few days, let things settle down. But as I loaded up the car, I had the horrible feeling that someone was watching me. I looked around, but I didn't see anything. Still, the sensation wouldn't go away. It was like eyes were on me, from the woods, from the shadows, from somewhere I couldn't see. I drove into town and stayed at a motel that night. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just needed to get away, needed to sleep without the sound of footsteps echoing in my ears. But even in the motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally returned to the house a few days later, everything seemed normal. No signs of anyone having been there, no footprints on the porch, no damage to the windows or doors. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But I knew better. I could still feel it, that uneasy tension in the air, like someone was just out of sight, watching and waiting. That night, the footsteps came again. They were louder, more deliberate. They stopped right at the front door, and then, for the first time, there was a knock. Just one. Soft, but firm. I didn't move, didn't answer. The knocking came again, this time a little louder, more insistent. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I waited, praying it would stop, but the knocking continued. I knew I couldn't open the door, but I also knew I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whoever was on the other side. I crept over to the door, holding my breath, and looked through the peephole. There was nothing. The porch was empty. But the knocking kept coming, steady, deliberate. I backed away from the door, grabbed my car keys, and ran out the back. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, speeding away from the house. I never went back. I couldn't. I had rented a small cabin up in the mountains for a weekend, hoping for some peace and quiet. I needed a break from everything, just a few days to clear my head. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by thick woods, and I had planned on doing some hiking while I was there. The trails weren't well marked, but I figured I wouldn't stray too far, just enough to enjoy the fresh air and some solitude. On the second day, I set out in the early afternoon. The sun was still high, so I wasn't worried about getting lost or anything. I had my phone, and even though the signal was spotty, I thought I could find my way back without any trouble. I walked for about an hour, just following a narrow path that wound through the trees. It was quiet, except for the occasional sound of birds or the rustling of leaves in the wind. I was starting to think about turning back when I heard voices up ahead. At first, I thought it was other hikers, maybe a group just enjoying the woods like I was. But as I got closer, I realized something wasn't right. The voices were low, hushed, and there was an edge to them, like they were arguing or trying to keep quiet. I slowed down and crept forward until I could see through the trees. There were 4 men standing in a small clearing. They weren't dressed like hikers, though they had rifles slung over their shoulders and a pile of something at their feet. I squinted, trying to see what it was, and then I realized it was a deer. A dead one, freshly killed, with blood pooling in the grass. They were clearly hunting, but I knew this wasn't a hunting season, and something about the whole scene felt wrong. I must have made a noise because one of the men suddenly looked up in my direction. Our eyes met, and for a second, I froze. I didn't know what to do. My instinct was to turn and run, but I knew that would draw more attention. Instead, I stepped back, trying to move quietly, but my foot caught on a root, and I stumbled. The noise echoed through the trees, and now all 4 of them were looking right at me. One of them, a tall guy with a scruffy beard, said something to the others, and they all started walking toward me. I turned and started walking quickly back the way I came, trying not to break into a full sprint. My heart was pounding, and I could hear them behind me, their footsteps getting closer. They weren't calling out or anything, just following, and that's what scared me the most. If they had just wanted to tell me to leave or that I was on private land, they would have said something. But they didn't. I kept moving, trying to stay calm, but I could hear them getting closer. One of them called out, "Hey, wait up," in a voice that didn't sound friendly. I ignored it and kept walking faster. I knew the trail was ahead, but it felt like I wasn't getting any closer to it. I could feel their eyes on me, and I started to panic. Then, I heard one of them say, "She's gonna tell someone," and that was all I needed to hear. I broke into a run, not caring about the noise I was making now. I just needed to get away. I could hear them running after me, their boots crashing through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept running. The trail finally came into view, and I veered onto it, hoping they would stop chasing me once I was back on the main path. But they didn't. I could still hear them behind me, not as close as before, but close enough that I couldn't stop. I didn't know how long I could keep running, but I knew I couldn't let them catch up. I kept going, the trees blurring past me as I sprinted down the trail. I didn't know where I was headed, but anywhere was better than staying near those men. I could still hear them, but they seemed to be falling behind. Maybe they weren't as familiar with the trail, or maybe they thought I'd tire out soon. Either way, I didn't slow down. After what felt like forever, I saw the cabin through the trees. I ran straight for it, fumbling with the door as I tried to get my keys out. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped them, but I managed to get the door open and slammed it behind me, locking it with trembling fingers. I stood there, listening for any sign that they had followed me all the way back, but all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. I didn't dare look out the window, afraid of what I might see. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, praying that I'd have enough of a signal to get through. The operator picked up, and I tried to explain what had happened, my words tumbling over each other. They said they'd send someone out, but it would take time, there weren't any officers nearby. I hung up and sat down on the floor, trying to calm down, but every little sound outside made me jump. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting for someone to show up. Finally, I heard the sound of a car pulling up, and I peeked out the window to see a sheriff's vehicle. I ran outside, practically throwing myself at the deputy, trying to explain everything that had happened. They searched the area but didn't find the men. They told me that poaching wasn't uncommon in these parts, but they'd never heard of anyone getting violent over it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I hadn't run, if I hadn't gotten away when I did, something much worse would have happened. I packed up and left the cabin the next morning. I didn't care about getting a refund or staying the rest of the weekend. I just wanted to be as far away from those woods as possible. I had rented the cabin for a quiet weekend, some time away from the city, but I didn't plan on getting snowed in. The blizzard came out of nowhere. By late afternoon, the wind was howling, and snow was piling up against the windows. I had enough food, and the cabin had a fireplace, so I figured I'd just ride it out. I wasn't too worried at first. It was sometime after midnight when I first heard the knocking. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling something, but the sound was too steady. It was 3 slow knocks, followed by a pause, and then 3 more. I waited, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, but there it was again. The same pattern. I got up and went to the door. There's a small window next to it, so I peeked through. It was dark outside, and all I could see was snow blowing around. I almost turned away when I saw him. There was a man standing just outside the porch light, barely visible through the storm. He was hunched over, his face mostly hidden by a hood. I could only make out his mouth and the lower half of his face. "Hey," he called out. His voice sounded muffled by the wind. "I need help." I hesitated. I wasn't sure how he could have made it this far into the storm. The roads were buried, and the nearest house was miles away. But there he was, just standing there, looking like he was freezing. Something felt off, but I couldn't just leave him out there, could I? I opened the door a crack, keeping the chain on. "What do you need?" I asked. "I'm lost," he said. "Can I come in?" Just for a minute, to warm up. His voice didn't match his face. It was too calm, too steady for someone who had supposedly been wandering through a blizzard. I couldn't explain it, but the way he asked made my skin crawl. He didn't sound desperate. He sounded rehearsed. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, still keeping the door mostly shut. "Please," he said, taking a step closer. "I just need to warm up for a bit." I glanced behind him. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that he had walked up to the cabin. The snow was undisturbed, completely smooth, except where he was standing. That didn't make any sense. "How did you get here?" I asked. "I was driving and my car slid off the road," he said. "I've been walking for hours." I couldn't see any car tracks either. There was nothing. My hand tightened on the doorknob. Something wasn't right about this guy. Everything about him felt wrong, like he didn't belong out there in the storm. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I can't let you in." The man's smile dropped. For a second, he just stared at me, not saying anything. Then he reached out and grabbed the doorknob, pulling at it hard enough to make the chain rattle. "Let me in," he said, his voice low and flat now. "It's freezing out here." My heart was pounding. I slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away quickly. The knocking started again, louder this time, more insistent. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but when I looked at the screen, there was no signal. No bars, nothing. I ran over to the landline on the kitchen counter, but it was dead too. The storm must have taken down the lines. I was completely cut off. The knocking kept going, louder and louder. I grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the kitchen drawer and backed up against the far wall, staring at the door. He wasn't saying anything anymore, just knocking, over and over. I could hear the wind howling outside, but underneath it, I could hear his voice, low and steady, repeating the same words, "Let me in." It felt like hours before the knocking finally stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I stood there, listening, but I couldn't hear anything outside anymore. I wanted to believe he was gone, but I didn't dare check. I stayed there, gripping the knife, staring at the door, until my legs ached from standing. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I moved to the bedroom and locked the door behind me. I could still hear the wind outside, but nothing else. No more knocking. No more voices. I told myself he had left, that he had given up and gone to find shelter somewhere else. But I didn't sleep. In the morning, the storm had calmed down. I forced myself to go to the front door and look outside. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The snow was completely undisturbed. I packed up and left as soon as the roads were cleared enough to drive. I didn't care if my weekend was cut short. Something had been out there in the storm, and whatever it wasn't a man lost in the snow. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A quiet weekend at an off-grid cabin seemed like the perfect escape. No phone service, no distractions, just a few days to read, hike, and clear my mind. It was tucked away in the woods, far from the nearest town, and completely isolated. The first night had gone smoothly. The fireplace kept the cabin warm, and I spent the evening reading by lantern light before going to bed early. Everything was peaceful. The second night, though, something changed. It was around midnight when the power went out. 1 second, I was sitting on the couch with a blanket, listening to the wind outside, and the next, the lights flickered and went out completely. The heater clicked off too, and suddenly the cabin felt cold. I wasn't too worried at first. Being so far out, I figured it could just be a typical power cut. It was an old cabin, after all, and the wiring might have been faulty. I got up, feeling my way through the dark to find the flashlight I'd brought with me. When I flicked it on, the beam cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the walls. I went to the breaker box near the back door. Maybe it had just tripped, I thought. I opened the box and looked inside, but everything seemed fine. No switches had flipped. That was when a strange feeling crept over me. I glanced out the small window by the door. The wind had died down, and everything outside was still, but there was something unsettling about the silence. I didn't see anything, just the black outline of the trees and the moonlight reflecting off the snow. But it felt like someone was watching me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Still, I decided to check the generator outside. It wasn't too far from the cabin, just a few steps out the back. I grabbed my coat and boots, pulled them on, and stepped out into the cold. The air was freezing, biting in my face, and the snow crunched under my feet as I walked toward the generator. The flashlight beam bounced in front of me, and that's when I saw it. The generator cover had been lifted, and the cables were cut clean through. It wasn't an accident. Someone had done it on purpose. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the wires. My mind raced, trying to process what I was looking at. The cables hadn't frayed, hadn't worn out. They'd been cut. Someone had been here. Someone had done this. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one in sight. Just the empty woods, the trees standing tall and dark, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I was alone, at least I thought I was. But if someone had cut the power, they couldn't be far. I hurried back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. My breathing was shallow, and I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just a prank, I told myself. Maybe some kids messing around. But it didn't feel like a prank. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. I tried my phone, but of course, there was no signal. No landline, either. My only option was to wait it out until morning, when I could drive to the nearest town and call for help. I glanced at the clock, barely past midnight. I had hours to go. I moved a chair to block the door and sat there with my flashlight, waiting. Every little sound made me jump: the creak of the cabin, the wind rattling the window panes, the branches tapping against the roof. My mind kept playing tricks on me, imagining shadows moving outside, footsteps crunching in the snow. Then, there was a real noise. A soft knock on the window. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned the flashlight toward the window, shining it through the glass. Nothing. Just the empty night, the snow still falling gently outside. But I heard it. I know I had. I sat there, gripping the flashlight tightly, barely breathing. Minutes passed, then another knock, this time at the back door. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would explode. Someone was out there, circling the cabin, knocking just to let me know they were there. Playing with me. The knocking moved again, this time to the front door. Then the windows, tapping softly but deliberately. They were everywhere, and I couldn't see them, but they knew I was inside. I felt trapped, like a rabbit in a cage, and I didn't know what to do. If I stayed inside, they could break in. But if I went out there, I had no idea who or what I was facing. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse. It was like waiting for the other shoe to drop, knowing something was coming but not when. My eyes kept darting around, my hands trembling. Then, I heard the doorknob turn. Just a soft click, like someone testing it, seeing if I had forgotten to lock it. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight tighter. Whoever it was stood there for a long moment, then I heard footsteps moving away, back into the snow. I didn't relax. I didn't move from that chair for the rest of the night, keeping the flashlight pointed at the door, waiting for the sun to come up. When morning finally came, I packed my things, shoved them into the car, and didn't look back. I didn't even bother trying to figure out who had been out there or why they had cut the power. I just drove, not stopping until I was far away from that cabin, back in the safety of the nearest town. Whatever had happened, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I was looking forward to some quiet time alone in the woods. I rented this small cabin for the weekend, just me and the trees, away from everything. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. It was perfect, or so I thought. I got there around noon, parked the car, and started to unpack. The weather was clear, the woods were quiet, and everything seemed normal. I took a short hike that afternoon to get familiar with the area. The trail was barely used, just a narrow dirt path cutting through the thick trees. About an hour into the walk, I saw another hiker coming toward me from the opposite direction. He was older, maybe in his late 40s, wearing an old, worn-out jacket. He didn't look like someone who was just out for a casual hike. As we got closer, he stopped and looked at me for a moment. Then, without much of a greeting, he said, "You shouldn't be here. This area isn't safe, especially not after dark." I wasn't sure if he was messing with me or if he really meant it. His voice was flat, serious. I asked him why, but he just shook his head. "Just leave before nightfall," he said, then walked past me, continuing down the trail without looking back. It was a weird encounter, but I shrugged it off. I figured he was just some local trying to scare off tourists. I wasn't going to let it ruin my weekend. I turned around and headed back to the cabin. By the time I got there, it was late afternoon. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. I settled in for the evening, cooking some dinner and lighting a fire in the small fireplace. The cabin was cozy, and I felt pretty relaxed. I kept thinking about the man on the trail, though. His words kept replaying in my mind. Leave before nightfall. What did he mean by that? I tried to push it out of my head, but it lingered there, gnawing at me. Around 8 p.m., it started to get really dark. Out here, there were no streetlights or house lights in the distance, just pure darkness surrounding the cabin. I hadn't planned on going outside again, but I decided to step out for a minute to get some air. As soon as I opened the door, I felt it. The air was colder than it had been all day, and the woods were too quiet. No wind, no animals, just complete silence. I stood there for a minute, looking out into the trees, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was like the forest was watching me. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but I didn't see anything. Still, I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling, so I went back inside and locked the door. I sat down by the fire, trying to distract myself with a book, but every little sound outside caught my attention. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, it all seemed too close. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see something, but the darkness was too thick. The cabin's small windows didn't offer much of a view anyway. Just blackness beyond the glass. Then, I heard it, a soft tapping at the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, listening, but it didn't happen again. I told myself it was just the wind, even though there hadn't been any wind all night. Still, I got up and looked through the window, shining my flashlight outside. Nothing. Just the trees and the empty trail leading into the woods. I sat back down, trying to calm down, but it happened again. This time it wasn't a tap, it was a knock. Slow and deliberate. I jumped up, my pulse racing. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. I backed away, suddenly feeling very alone and very exposed. The knock came again, louder this time, from the back of the cabin. It sounded like someone was walking around outside, testing the windows and doors. I grabbed the flashlight and ran to the back window, but there was still nothing. The woods were empty. I thought about the man from earlier. Maybe he was trying to scare me, to mess with me for not taking his warning seriously. Or maybe it was someone else. I didn't know what to think, but the fear was real. I tried to call someone, anyone, but of course, there was no signal this deep in the woods. For the next hour, I sat there, every muscle in my body tense, listening. The footsteps outside came and went, circling the cabin. Each time, they stopped for a while, and then they'd start up again. It felt like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there, but didn't want to show themselves. I tried to stay calm, but every minute that passed made it harder. I locked the door, pulled the curtain shut, and turned off the lights, hoping to make it look like I wasn't there. Maybe they'd leave me alone if they thought the cabin was empty. But the knocking didn't stop. It moved around the cabin, slowly, deliberately. Tap. 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 Like they were waiting for me to come out or make a move. At some point, the knocking stopped completely. It was so sudden that it was almost worse. The silence pressed down on me, making my skin crawl. I didn't dare move. I sat there in the dark, staring at the door, waiting. Then, I heard it. A voice. Quiet and low, just outside the door. "Come out," it said. "Come outside." It was the same voice as the man from the trail. My blood went cold. I knew it wasn't a trick of my mind. Someone was really there, trying to lure me out. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, praying that they'd leave. Minutes passed. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Finally, the voice faded, and I heard footsteps crunching through the snow, moving away from the cabin. I waited, heart racing, until I couldn't hear anything at all. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, listening, just waiting for the sound of footsteps to return. But they never did. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things and left without looking back. I had been looking forward to this cabin rental for weeks. It was supposed to be a relaxing escape from my hectic life. The cabin was nestled in a quiet area with beautiful views of the surrounding mountains. It seemed perfect when I arrived, clean, well kept, and isolated enough to feel private. The first day was everything I hoped for. I spent the morning hiking, then enjoyed a peaceful afternoon reading on the porch. The tranquility was exactly what I needed. That night, I slept soundly, lulled by the silence of the woods. On the second day, I decided to take a closer look around the cabin. It was bigger than it had seemed in the pictures, with several rooms and a cozy living area. I began exploring, just to get a better feel for the place. When I went into the master bedroom, I noticed something strange. The closet door was slightly ajar, and there was a small black device on the shelf. At first, I thought it was some kind of alarm or a remote control. I picked it up and examined it, but it had no obvious labels or buttons. Curiosity got the better of me, so I turned it over. That's when I saw the small lens hidden in the corner. It dawned on me that it might be a camera. I checked around the room more carefully and found another small device tucked behind a lamp on the nightstand. My heart started racing. I immediately went to check the other rooms. In the guest room, I found a similar setup with a camera hidden behind a painting on the wall. My anxiety grew with each new discovery. There was a camera in the living area too, hidden inside a fake smoke detector on the ceiling. I felt sick. I had trusted this place, and now I realized that my privacy had been completely invaded. I tried to stay calm and think logically. I knew I had to leave and report this to the authorities. I gathered my things quickly, trying to act as normal as possible, but my mind was spinning. As I was heading toward the door, I saw a car pull up outside. It was the cabin owner. He had arrived unexpectedly. Panic surged through me. I didn't want to confront him, but I also didn't want to stay any longer. I decided to go outside and explain that I needed to leave. As I stepped out, he greeted me with a warm smile. "Everything all right?" he asked. I tried to keep my voice steady as I told him I had just realized I needed to cut my stay short. He seemed confused but nodded. "Sure, no problem. Is there anything I can help with?" His friendliness felt forced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't want to say too much. I just wanted to get away. As I loaded my car, I saw him watching me from the porch. I felt his eyes on my back as I worked quickly, trying to stay calm despite my fear. When I was almost done packing, he came over to me. "I just want to make sure you're okay," he said, looking genuinely concerned. "Is everything all right with the cabin?" I hesitated, then decided to be straightforward. "I found cameras in the cabin. I'm not comfortable staying here anymore." His expression changed in an instant. The concern melted away, replaced by something I couldn't quite place. "Cameras?" he asked, his voice cold. "There must be a misunderstanding." I was about to reply when he suddenly stepped closer. "Let me show you something," he said. "I assure you, there's no reason to be alarmed." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had to decide quickly. I told him I didn't want to see anything and that I was leaving. I tried to get into my car, but he moved to block my path. He raised his hands, as if to calm me. "Please, just hear me out. The cameras are for security. There's nothing to worry about." I backed away, shaking my head. "No, I'm not staying. I'm calling the police." I reached for my phone, but he grabbed my arm. His grip was firm but not violent. "You don't need to do that," he said. "This is all a misunderstanding. I can explain everything." I pulled free and got into my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I saw him standing there, watching, as I started the engine. I didn't dare look back as I drove away, my heart pounding. I made it to the nearest town and contacted the authorities. They took my report seriously and promised to investigate. Later that day, I learned that the cabin owner had been reported for similar incidents before. It seemed I wasn't the first to discover something troubling in one of his properties. I never went back to that cabin or any of his other rentals. The experience left me shaken, but I was relieved to have left when I did. I decided to take a solo trip to clear my head. It had been a stressful few months at work, and I needed a break from everything. I booked a cabin in the woods, far away from the noise and people. It was supposed to be just a weekend, some time to hike, read, and relax. I didn't expect anything strange to happen. The cabin was small but comfortable. It had everything I needed: a bed, a small kitchen, and a fireplace. It was isolated, tucked deep into the forest. There wasn't anyone around for miles, which was exactly what I wanted. The air was crisp, and the trees were thick. The only sounds were the wind and the occasional bird. I arrived in the afternoon and spent some time unpacking and settling in. I was planning to take a hike before dinner, so I grabbed my backpack and set out on one of the trails behind the cabin. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. The sun was starting to set, so I decided to head back. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. Just outside the cabin, near the tree line, was a small camping setup. It looked like someone had left their gear there, a tent, a backpack, and some supplies. But I hadn't seen anyone all day, and this cabin was supposed to be private. There shouldn't have been anyone else around. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the gear. It didn't make sense. Maybe someone had gotten lost or set up camp nearby. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. I thought about calling out, but something about the situation felt off. I decided to ignore it for now and went inside to make dinner. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Why would someone leave their gear so close to the cabin? And where were they? I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see someone walking up to the door. But no one came. I went to bed early, hoping to get some rest. But around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. It sounded like shuffling, like someone was moving around outside the cabin. My heart started racing. I lay there for a moment, listening. The noise stopped. I got out of bed and walked over to the window. I couldn't see much in the dark, but something was definitely off. The camping gear that had been near the tree line earlier was now closer to the cabin. Much closer. It was right outside the front door. My stomach dropped. There was no way the wind could have moved it that far. Someone had moved it. Someone was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it out the window, but I couldn't see anyone. The forest was silent. I didn't know what to do. My phone didn't have service out here, and I didn't want to go outside to check. I decided to lock the doors and try to go back to sleep, though it was hard to relax knowing that someone had been outside my cabin. I finally drifted off, but I woke up again a few hours later to the same noise. This time, it was louder, closer. It sounded like footsteps, like someone was walking around the cabin. I stayed still, trying to calm my breathing. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I was paralyzed with fear. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. I could hear them standing just outside, almost like they were waiting. I didn't dare move. I listened, hoping they would go away, but the silence stretched on. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the footsteps again, moving away from the door. I let out a shaky breath. I waited a few minutes before getting up and looking out the window. The camping gear was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept the lights off and stayed by the window, watching. There was no sign of anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little sound made me jump. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside to look around. There was no trace of the camping gear or anyone else. It was like nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. Someone had been out there, moving closer and closer to the cabin throughout the night. I didn't feel safe anymore. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, determined to leave. I didn't want to stick around to see if whoever it was would come back. As I was loading my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt outside the front door, there were fresh footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, like a man's. They circled around the cabin, leading back into the woods. I jumped in the car and drove out of there as fast as I could. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road stayed empty. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the cabin. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted. The whole thing felt like some kind of game, like they were testing me, seeing how close they could get without being caught. I haven't gone camping since. The scariest part is not knowing. Not knowing who was out there, what they wanted, or why they didn't try to get inside. I rented a small cabin for the weekend, just to get away for a bit. It was supposed to be peaceful. I had been feeling stressed, overwhelmed by everything, and thought some time in the woods would help clear my head. The cabin was about 20 minutes off the main road, tucked away by itself. No other cabins nearby, which was fine by me. I liked the idea of being alone. The first night was quiet. I made some tea, read a book by the fire, and went to bed early. But when I woke up, I heard something. At first, I thought it was wind or maybe the owls settling. You know how old places creak and groan. But this wasn't that. It was a scratching sound. Faint at first, but once I fully woke up, I realized it was coming from beneath the cabin. I thought maybe an animal had gotten under there, some raccoon or something. I tried to ignore it, thinking it would go away. But the scratching didn't stop. It came and went in bursts, sometimes soft, sometimes louder. It bothered me enough that I couldn't go back to sleep. I got up, put on my jacket, and went outside to check. There was nothing obvious when I walked around the cabin. It was pitch black, though, and I couldn't see much. I had a flashlight, but the beam wasn't very strong. I didn't want to get too close to the crawl space under the cabin. The ground sloped down at the back, and there was an opening big enough for animals to get in. I shined the light, but I couldn't see anything moving. Just some dead leaves and dirt. I decided it wasn't worth poking around in the dark, so I went back inside. The scratching had stopped by the time I lay down again, and I was able to fall back asleep. The next morning, I was drinking coffee on the porch when I heard it again. That scratching, this time louder. Like something was really trying to dig under there. I put my cup down and went to investigate, this time in daylight. I looked around the back of the cabin, where I had seen the crawl space opening the night before, and noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were fresh scratches in the dirt, like something had been dragged. I crouched down and saw that the opening was bigger than it had been last night. It looked like someone had pulled away more of the boards. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I figured maybe some animal was nesting down there. I didn't know what else it could be. But part of me felt uneasy. The scratches were too deliberate, too neat. It didn't look like something an animal would do. I grabbed a shovel I had found in the shed up back and tried to push some dirt and leaves back into the hole, figuring I could block it off for the night. As I was pushing dirt into the hole, I heard something else. It wasn't scratching this time, but a soft shuffling sound. Like someone moving inside the cabin. I stood up straight, heart pounding, and listened. The sound was coming from under my feet. I wasn't sure what to do at first. The sound stopped as soon as I moved, like whoever, or whatever, was down there had heard me. I walked back inside, locked the door, and sat down on the couch. My heart wouldn't stop racing. I thought about calling someone, but who? I was miles away from anyone, and it wasn't like I could call the police about some scratching sounds. They'd think I was crazy. The scratching didn't come back for the rest of the day, and I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe it was just an animal. But when night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to go to bed early again, but I kept hearing things. Small noises. Creaks. The wind, maybe. I couldn't tell. Then, around midnight, the scratching came back. Louder this time. Not just scratching, though. There was a tapping sound, like something knocking against wood. I sat up in bed, listening, my whole body tense. The noise was directly under me, under the floorboards. I couldn't just lie there and listen to it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight, put on my shoes, and went outside. I circled the cabin, stopping at the crawl space. It looked the same as before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I crouched down and shined the light under the cabin, expecting to see something move. But there was nothing. I stood up, ready to go back inside, when I noticed something strange. There was a small trapdoor hidden in the ground, just to the side of the crawl space. It was half buried under dirt and leaves, but I could see the outline of it now that I was looking closely. I hadn't noticed it before. I should have walked away. I should have left it alone. But I didn't. Something about the door made me feel like I had to know what was inside. I crouched down and pulled at the handle. It was heavy, and the hinges creaked as I lifted it. A damp, musty smell hit me as soon as the door opened. I shined the flashlight into the darkness and saw a set of stairs leading down. The stairs were old, rotting wood, and they disappeared into the dark. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to shut the door and go back inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see what was down there. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs. The air was thick and heavy, and it smelled like mildew and something else I couldn't place. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the deeper I went, the colder it got. I reached the bottom and found myself in what looked like an old basement or cellar. It was small, with dirt walls and a low ceiling. The floor was uneven, and there were a few broken pieces of furniture scattered around. That's when I saw it. In the far corner, there was a small pile of blankets and a few empty cans of food. Someone had been living down here. Recently. My heart started racing again, and I backed up, ready to bolt up the stairs. But then I heard a noise. A soft shuffling, like someone moving in the dark. I turned the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but I didn't see anything. The sound was coming from behind the pile of blankets. I froze. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard a voice. A low, raspy whisper. Help me. I dropped the flashlight and ran. I didn't stop until I was back inside the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely lock it. I stood there, panting, listening. There was nothing. Just silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No more scratching, no more voices. Just silence. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and left. I didn't look back. I drove straight to the nearest town and found a hotel. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't know how to explain it, and I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. But I know what I heard. And I know someone was down there, living under the cabin, watching me. I was on my way to the cabin I had rented for the weekend, trying to get away from everything. Work had been a mess, life wasn't much better, so a few days in the woods seemed like the perfect break. I'd been driving for hours, feeling the tension ease as the city disappeared behind me. The roads became narrower, trees thicker, and eventually, I was on a dirt path winding through the forest. My GPS was spotty at best, but I had written down the directions, and the rental company had given me a map. I figured I'd be fine. At some point, I must have missed a turn. I'm still not sure when or where, but I remember driving past a fork in the road, the trees closing in a bit more. I thought maybe I was still on the right path because it all looked the same: woods, dirt road, the occasional sign. But after a while, something felt off. I should have reached the cabin by then. I slowed down, looking for landmarks or something familiar, but everything around me seemed strange and unfamiliar. Eventually, I saw a cabin up ahead, tucked back in the trees. I figured maybe I was closer than I thought, so I pulled up, relieved to see the place. The cabin looked just like the pictures I'd seen online, small, wooden, with a porch. I parked the car and got out, stretching my legs after the long drive. It wasn't until I was standing in front of the door that I noticed something was wrong. There were people inside. I could hear voices, laughter, and the clatter of dishes. This wasn't my cabin. The place I'd rented was supposed to be empty, just me for the weekend. I was confused. I walked back to my car, thinking I'd better check the directions again, figure out where I went wrong. As I was pulling out the map, the front door creaked open and a woman stepped out. She looked to be in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, with long, graying hair tied back in a loose braid. She wore a simple dress, kind of old-fashioned, like something you'd see in an old movie. She smiled at me, but it didn't feel right. Something about her expression seemed off. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice sweet but strange, like she was forcing it to sound friendly. I stammered for a second, feeling awkward. Ah, I think I made a wrong turn. I was looking for a cabin I rented. Her smile didn't waver. You're not lost. Come on in, have some dinner. It's almost ready. I was taken aback by how casually she invited me in, like we were old friends or something. My gut told me to decline, but she was standing there, staring at me expectantly. Before I could think of an excuse, a man appeared behind her in the doorway. He was taller than her, broad-shouldered, and wearing a worn-out flannel shirt. His face was expressionless, eyes fixed on me. You should stay, he said, his voice deep and steady. It's getting dark. I glanced at the sky, realizing the sun had dipped lower than I thought. Still, I didn't like the idea of staying with people I didn't know, especially since something about the whole situation felt wrong. But they were both standing there, waiting for me to respond, and it felt strange to refuse. Against my better judgment, I nodded. Just for a few minutes, I said. Then I'll get back on the road. The woman's smile lightened. Of course. Come in. I followed them inside, instantly feeling a chill as I crossed the threshold. The inside of the cabin was dimly lit, with a few old lamps casting a dull yellow light. The place smelled like food, something savory and rich, though I couldn't quite place what it was. There was a small dining table set up with plates, cutlery, and glasses, like they'd been expecting someone. 2 other people were already seated at the table, a teenage girl, maybe 16, and a younger boy, around 10. They both looked up at me when I entered, but neither of them said a word. The girl had the same strange smile as the woman, and the boy stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Sit, the man said, pointing to an empty chair. I hesitated for a second before sitting down. The woman disappeared into the kitchen, and I could hear her moving around, the sound of pots and pans clanging together. The man sat across from me, still staring without blinking. What brings you out here? He asked. Just needed a break, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Rented a cabin for the weekend, but I must have taken the wrong road. You're here now, he said, his tone flat. I nodded, not knowing what else to say. The room was quiet except for the occasional clatter from the kitchen. I could feel the girl's eyes on me, though I didn't dare look at her. Something about her made my skin crawl. After a few minutes, the woman returned with a large pot, setting it down in the middle of the table. She ladled something thick and steaming into the bowls in front of us. It smelled strong, almost overpowering, and I felt my stomach turn. I wasn't hungry, but I knew it would be rude not to eat. Go on, the woman urged. Eat up. I picked up the spoon and dipped it into the bowl, hesitating before bringing it to my mouth. The taste was off. It was thick and greasy, and I couldn't tell what kind of meat it was. I forced myself to swallow a few bites, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my gut. The man kept watching me, never touching his own food. The kids ate in silence, their eyes flicking between me and the adults. The woman sat at the head of the table, smiling that same unsettling smile. So, you're traveling alone? She asked, her tone casual but with an edge to it. Yeah, I said, glancing toward the window. The sun was nearly gone, and the sky outside had turned a deep shade of purple. I should probably get going soon. Nonsense, the man said. It's too late to be driving now. You'll stay here tonight. My heart skipped a beat. I really can't. I need to find the cabin I rented. You're staying, the woman said, her voice a little sharper this time. It's not safe to be out there after dark. I could feel the tension in the room shift. The air seemed to get heavier, and the man leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. You don't want to go out there, he said. Trust me. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I didn't know how to get out without causing a scene. I stood up, trying to keep my voice steady. I appreciate the offer, but I really need to get going. Thank you for the meal. The man stood up too, moving faster than I expected. He blocked my path to the door, his expression darkening. You're not leaving, he said, his voice low. Panic surged through me. I backed up, bumping into the table. The woman stood as well, her smile gone now, replaced with a cold, hard stare. The kids remained seated, watching the scene unfold without a word. "I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice shaking. "I just need to leave." The man didn't move. He stood there, towering over me, his fists clenched at his sides. I glanced around the room, looking for another way out, but the only door was the one he was blocking. "You're not leaving," the woman repeated, her voice eerily calm. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest chair and shoved it toward the man, trying to create enough space to run. He stumbled back, startled, and I bolted for the door. I yanked it open and sprinted outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't look back. I could hear them shouting behind me, their voices echoing in the dark, but I didn't stop. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook. Finally, I got the door open, jumped in, and slammed it shut. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas, tearing down the dirt road as fast as I could. In the rearview mirror, I saw the cabin getting smaller and smaller, the figures of the family standing in the doorway, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road. My heart was still pounding, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. I pulled over, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing with what had just happened. I don't know who they were, or what they wanted, but I know I was lucky to get out of there. It was my second week working at the fire lookout, and things had been pretty quiet. The cabin was small but cozy, sitting on a hill with a clear view of the surrounding forest. I spent most of my time scanning the trees for smoke, listening to the radio for any signs of trouble, and writing in my journal to pass the time. It was peaceful in its own way, and the isolation didn't bother me much. That evening, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the trees. The sky was a deep orange, and I could see the tops of the pine trees swaying gently in the breeze. I was about to make myself something to eat when the radio crackled to life. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, I need help." The voice was shaky, panicked. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button to respond. "This is the fire lookout." "Who's calling?" There was a pause, followed by more static. Then the voice came back, sounding even more desperate. "I'm lost. My camp. I can't find my camp. Please, I don't know where I am." I looked out over the forest, squinting into the fading light. I didn't see anything unusual, no smoke, no movement. But the voice on the radio sounded close, like whoever it was couldn't be more than a mile or two away. "Can you tell me where you are?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Do you see any landmarks?" There was a long pause, and I could hear heavy breathing on the other end. "I'm near a creek," the voice said finally. "I can hear the water, but I don't know where I am. I don't know how to get back." The nearest creek was about a mile east of the cabin. I knew the area pretty well from the maps I'd studied, and it shouldn't have been hard to find the way back from there. But something about the way the person spoke, the way their voice shook, made me uneasy. "Stay where you are," I said. "I'll come to you. Just keep the radio on so I can find you." I grabbed my flashlight, a jacket, and my boots. The sun was almost gone by now, and the woods would be dark soon. I kept the radio clipped to my belt as I headed out, making my way down the hill toward the creek. The air was cool, and the sound of the forest at night was louder than usual, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. As I walked, I tried to reach the person again. "Can you still hear me?" "I'm on my way." More static, and then the voice again, quieter this time. "Please hurry. I don't feel safe out here." I quickened my pace, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trees closed in around me as I got closer to the creek, and the sound of the water grew louder. But something was bothering me. The voice on the radio, it hadn't sounded right. It was too calm now. Like whoever it was had given up, or was waiting for something. When I reached the creek, I called out, "I'm here. Can you hear me?" Silence. No voice, no response on the radio. I stood there for a moment, shining my flashlight around, looking for any sign of a person. But there was nothing, no campfire, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there recently. I pressed the button on the radio again. "Are you there?" "I'm at the creek." Nothing but static. I stood there for a while longer, my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. I knew there should have been some sign of the person, but the forest was empty. I tried calling out a few more times, but the only sound was the water rushing over the rocks. After a few minutes, I decided to head back to the cabin. Maybe the person had moved on, or maybe it had been a prank. Either way, I wasn't going to spend the night wandering around in the dark. I turned and started walking back, but the feeling of being watched crept up on me, like someone's eyes were on me the whole time. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than it should have. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone standing in the trees, but there was nothing. Just the shadows and the sound of my boots on the dirt path. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and sat down at the radio, trying to make contact again. "This is the lookout. Are you still out there?" There was no answer. I waited a few minutes, then tried again, but it was just static. I told myself that maybe the person had found their way back to their camp, or maybe their radio had died. But the uneasy feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. I spent the next hour scanning the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. The woods were still, too still. It was like the usual sounds of the forest had faded, leaving an unsettling silence behind. Eventually, I tried to convince myself that it was just my nerves, that the voice on the radio had probably found their way and was safe by now. But when I stood up to stretch and glanced out the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the distance, at the edge of the trees, there was a faint light, a small, flickering glow like a fire. It wasn't far from where the creek was, and it hadn't been there before. I grabbed the binoculars from the shelf and focused in on the light. It was a campfire, small but burning steadily. But there was no one around it. No tent, no person, just a fire burning alone in the dark. I turned away from the window, my hands shaking. Someone had been there. Someone had built that fire, but they were gone now. Or worse, they were still out there, watching. I double-checked the door, making sure it was locked. The windows were shut, the blinds pulled down. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to keep busy, checking the radio again, writing in my journal, but every few minutes, I found myself looking out the window, expecting to see someone standing in the trees. Around midnight, I heard it, the scratching. It was faint at first, like something brushing against the cabin's outer walls. I froze, listening, hoping it was just the wind. But then it came again, louder this time, coming from underneath the cabin. Scratching, like something or someone was under the floorboards. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously opened the door, stepping out onto the porch. The night air was cold, and the forest was pitch black, except for the dim glow of the campfire in the distance. I listened carefully, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. There it was again, the scratching, coming from under the cabin. I took a deep breath and walked around to the back of the cabin, shining my flashlight on the foundation. There was a small trapdoor I hadn't noticed before, barely big enough for a person to fit through. The scratches were louder now, more frantic, like something was trapped down there. I hesitated, my heart racing, but I knew I had to see what was causing the noise. I knelt down and slowly lifted the trapdoor, shining my flashlight into the darkness below. It wasn't an animal. There was a small space under the cabin, just big enough for someone to crawl into. And there, in the dirt, were signs that someone had been living there recently: empty food cans, a dirty blanket, and a pile of old clothes. The air down there smelled foul, like rot and mildew. But whoever had been down there was gone. I backed away, slamming the trapdoor shut and stumbling back onto the porch, my heart pounding in my chest. I rushed back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. Someone had been living under the cabin, watching me, listening to me. I didn't sleep that night, sitting in a chair by the window, clutching the flashlight in one hand and the radio in the other. The fire burned out sometime before dawn, and by morning, the woods were quiet again. But I knew I wasn't alone out there. I rented a cabin up north for a long weekend. It was one of those places you book online, nice pictures, looked secluded. The ad said it was perfect for anyone wanting to get away from it all. I needed that. Life had been stressful, work too much, everything too much. A quiet place in the woods sounded like exactly what I needed. When I arrived, it was just as advertised. The cabin was tucked back from the road, surrounded by trees. There wasn't another house in sight. The closest neighbor was probably miles away. I unloaded my stuff, set up inside, and spent the first night just enjoying the quiet. No cars, no people, just the sound of the wind in the trees. I spent the next day hiking around, exploring the woods. There was a small lake nearby where I spent a couple of hours sitting by the water, not doing much of anything. I was feeling good, relaxed. But that afternoon, I noticed something I hadn't seen when I first arrived, a shed, not far from the cabin, tucked behind some trees. It was locked. The lock was heavy, rusted. I thought it was strange that the rental description hadn't mentioned it. It was the only thing on the property besides the cabin itself, and it looked old, like it had been there a long time. I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was something about that shed that bothered me. I told myself it was probably just for storage tools, maybe gardening supplies, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the second day, my curiosity got the best of me. I went out to the shed again and inspected the lock. It didn't look very secure, just old and rusted, like it hadn't been touched in years. I don't know what came over me, but I decided to break it open. I figured I'd come this far, it wasn't like anyone would notice. I found a crowbar in the cabin and went back out to the shed. It didn't take much effort. The lock broke with a snap, and the door creaked open. Inside, it was dark. The light from the afternoon barely reached in, so I took out my phone and used the flashlight to look around. It smelled damp, like mold. Dust hung in the air, and I could see old wooden shelves lining the walls, stacked with random items, tools, cans of paint, a few old crates. But then, in the corner, something caught my eye. There was a small table with something on it, something that looked out of place. I walked closer, the beam of my phone's light shaking in my hand. On the table were a few personal belongings, an old watch, a set of keys, a wallet. Next to them was a stack of Polaroid photos, faded and yellowed with age. I picked up the wallet first, opening it slowly. Inside, there was a driver's license. The name wasn't familiar, but the date of birth stood out. The license had expired over a decade ago. I looked at the keys next, house keys, maybe, with a little keychain shaped like a dog. They didn't mean anything to me, but the photos. I started flipping through them. They were all of people, different people, some smiling, some looking away from the camera. The first few photos didn't seem strange. They looked like vacation shots, like people who had rented the cabin before. But as I kept going through them, the pictures became off. The people in the photos weren't smiling anymore. Some looked scared, like they didn't want their picture taken. The backgrounds were all the same, the cabin, the woods, the lake. In one of the last photos, I recognized the cabin's porch, the same place I had been sitting just that morning. The person in the picture was standing in the exact spot where I had been, staring straight at the camera, eyes wide with fear. I dropped the photos and stepped back, my heart pounding. What the hell was this? Why were these things locked in a shed on this property? Who were these people? I backed out of the shed, leaving the door open behind me. My mind was racing. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? I found some old photos in a shed? It didn't make sense. Maybe they were just left there by the previous owner, I told myself. Maybe it wasn't as weird as it seemed. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos, the fear in the faces of the people. I kept thinking about the last picture, the one on the porch. It felt like someone had been watching them, just like someone might be watching me. I got up several times during the night, pacing around the cabin, checking the windows. Everything was dark outside. The trees cast long shadows across the yard, and the only sound was the wind rustling the leaves. I kept telling myself that it was fine, that I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that someone had been here, and might still be here. The next morning, I decided to leave. I didn't care that I still had a day left on the rental. I packed my things quickly, avoiding the shed as I loaded the car. I wanted to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. Just as I was about to get in the car, I noticed something on the porch. I froze. It was a Polaroid photo, sitting on the wooden steps, face down. My hands were shaking as I bent down to pick it up. I already knew what it would be. When I turned it over, my stomach dropped. It was a picture of me, taken from behind, while I was standing at the edge of the lake. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anyone. But someone had been watching me. I threw the photo down, jumped in the car, and sped out of there. My heart didn't stop racing until I was miles away from the cabin, back on the highway, heading home. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who had taken that photo? And why had they left it for me to find? When I got home, I called the rental company, told them everything. They didn't seem to care. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard back from them. I didn't push it. I didn't want to know more. I tried to forget about it, to move on, but I couldn't. Every time I close my eyes, I see that last photo. I wonder who those people were, and what happened to them after their pictures were taken. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I get the feeling that someone is still watching me. I rented a small cabin by the beach for the weekend. It was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to get away from the city, to clear my head. The cabin was simple, one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area that faced the ocean. Big windows along the front of the house looked out onto the sand, and beyond that, the water stretched out endlessly. I picked this place because it was far from the main strip of beach rentals, tucked away on a quiet stretch of coast. The first day was nice. I walked along the shore, picked up some seashells, and listened to the waves crash against the sand. I didn't see anyone else the whole time, just me and the ocean. That's what I wanted, some time to myself, to think. The weather was calm then, cloudy but warm, and I could hear the wind in the distance, the sound of a storm building far off. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear it howling against the windows, the wooden cabin creaking as the gusts pushed against it. The rain started shortly after, soft at first, then harder as the storm came in. The thunder sounded like it was getting closer, flashes of lightning lighting up the dark sky in quick bursts. I stayed inside, made myself some dinner, and tried to ignore the storm. It wasn't uncommon out here, being so close to the water. I told myself it was just nature doing its thing. By the time I finished eating, the wind was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. I had turned on some music to distract myself, but then the power went out. Everything went dark. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning outside, bright enough to light up the entire room for just a second before disappearing again. I fumbled around in the dark for my phone, using it as a flashlight. I found some candles in the kitchen drawer and lit them, placing them around the room. The flickering light cast strange shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel smaller, more closed in. I sat down on the couch, trying to relax, listening to the storm rage outside. The wind was almost deafening now, the sound of rain pelting against the windows constant. I wasn't scared, not yet. I had been through plenty of storms like this before, and I knew it would pass eventually. I just had to wait it out. It must have been sometime after midnight when I saw him. The storm was still going strong, and I had gotten up to check the windows again, making sure they were all shut tight. As I walked past the big window in the living room, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a storm playing tricks on me, the rain and wind distorting my view, but then I realized there was someone standing on the beach, just beyond the edge of the water. It was a man. He was standing completely still, facing the cabin, looking right at me. I couldn't see his face clearly, it was too dark, and the rain was pouring down, but I could tell he was watching me. My heart started to race, and I took a step back from the window, instinctively. I couldn't understand why anyone would be out there in this storm, especially at this hour. There were no other cabins nearby, no reason for someone to be on this stretch of beach. I waited for him to move, to walk away, but he didn't. He just stood there, staring. I thought about calling the police, but my phone had no signal. I was too far up from the town, and the storm probably knocked out whatever cell towers were around. I felt trapped, isolated, with no way to contact anyone. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just a lost hiker or someone caught in the storm. Maybe he needed help. But as the minutes passed and he still didn't move, I started to feel uneasy, like something was very wrong. I closed the curtains, blocking out the sight of him. It didn't help. I could still feel him standing out there, could still picture him just beyond the window, watching. I told myself not to panic. Maybe he'd leave. Maybe he'd move on when he realized no one was going to let him in. But an hour passed, and I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about him, wondering if he was still there, if he had gotten closer. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled the curtain back just a little, peeking through the window. He was still there, closer now, standing just at the edge of the sand, maybe 30 feet from the cabin. The rain was falling harder than ever, the wind whipping through the air, but he didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his face turned toward the window. I could see more of him now. He was tall, wearing some kind of dark jacket, his hair matted down from the rain. He looked soaked through, but he didn't seem to care. He just kept watching me. I dropped the curtain and backed away from the window, my heart pounding. This wasn't normal. No one would stand out there like that, not for this long. I thought about locking the door, but I had already checked it earlier. Everything was locked. I was safe inside, or at least that's what I tried to tell myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something, waiting for me. I walked around the cabin, checking every window, making sure everything was secure. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The storm made everything worse, drowning out any sounds except for the wind and rain. I wouldn't hear him if he tried to get in. Another flash of lightning lit up the room, and for a second, I thought I saw a shadow move outside. I froze, listening, trying to hear anything over the storm, but there was nothing. Just the relentless pounding of the rain. I went back to the window, slowly pulling the curtain aside again. My breath caught in my throat. He was even closer now, standing halfway between the cabin and the water, his feet sinking into the wet sand. I could see his face now, though it was still shadowed by the darkness. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't moving. Just standing there, watching. I couldn't stay in the cabin. I had to get out of there, but I didn't know how. My car was parked out back, but I'd have to go outside to get to it. And he was right there, just a few feet away. I sat down, trying to think, trying to calm myself. The storm wasn't letting up, and there was no way I could leave until morning. But I couldn't stay here, not with him out there, not knowing what he wanted. I decided to wait it out. If he hadn't tried to get in by now, maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he'd leave once the storm passed. I kept telling myself that, over and over, even though I didn't believe it. I sat in the dark for hours, listening to the storm, listening for any sound of him outside. Every time the lightning flashed, I checked the window, hoping he'd be gone, but he never was. He was always there, closer each time, inching his way toward the cabin, like he was waiting for something, waiting for me to make a move. By the time the storm started to die down, it was almost morning. The rain had slowed, and the wind wasn't as fierce. I gathered my things quickly, deciding I'd make a run for the car as soon as it was light enough to see. I didn't care if the roads were flooded. I'd rather take my chances driving than stay another second in that cabin. As the sky started to lighten, I checked the window one last time. He was gone. The beach was empty, the water calm. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag, threw open the door, and ran to the car. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing there, but he wasn't. I drove straight home without stopping. It wasn't until I was miles away that I realized I hadn't even seen any footprints in the sand when I left. I rented a cabin for the weekend, a little place out in the woods. It wasn't fancy, just a small one-bedroom with a kitchen and a deck that faced the trees. The whole point of the trip was to get away from everything, just some quiet time to clear my head. I had a book, some food, and planned to just relax, no distractions. The nearest town was a good 40 minutes away, so it was completely isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. The first day was uneventful. I got there in the late afternoon, unpacked, and took a short walk around the property. The woods were dense, the kind of trees that block out a lot of sunlight even in the middle of the day. The cabin was set on a small clearing, with just enough space for a fire pit and a few chairs. It felt private, like I was cut off from the rest of the world. It was about an hour after I got settled when I first saw him. I was sitting on the porch, just taking in the quiet when a man came walking up the driveway. He was wearing a faded brown jacket, one that looked a bit too warm for the weather, and had a hat pulled low over his face. He waved as he got closer, a slow, deliberate motion that made me uneasy right away. "Hey there," he called out, still at a distance. "You must be the one renting the place." I nodded, standing up. I didn't know anyone else was supposed to be around, but I figured maybe he was the caretaker or something. "I'm John," he said, walking up to the steps of the porch. "I take care of the property when the owners are away. Just wanted to check in, make sure everything's in working order for you." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something about him that felt off, but I didn't want to be rude. "Everything's fine," I said, hoping that would be the end of it. "Well, I should show you around anyway," he said, stepping onto the porch without waiting for an invitation. "Make sure you know where everything is, in case you need anything." Before I could protest, he was already heading toward the door, like it was his place, not mine. I followed him inside, trying to shake the weird feeling that was creeping over me. He walked through the cabin like he knew it well, pointing out the obvious, where the bathroom was, how to work the stove, things I didn't need help with. His tone was friendly, but there was something underneath it, something a little too eager. He lingered in the living room, running his hand along the back of the couch, like he was inspecting it. "Nice place, huh?" he said, glancing at me. "Yeah, it's great," I replied, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But he didn't. Instead, he walked over to the window, looking out at the woods. "You gotta be careful out here," he said, his voice low. "Gets real dark at night. No one around for miles. If something happens, you're on your own." I didn't like the way he said it, like it was some kind of warning. I stood there, trying to figure out what to say, but nothing felt right. There was something strange about the way he was acting, like he was testing me, seeing how I'd react. "I'll be fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned back to me, still smiling, but his eyes were hard now, watching me closely. "Sure you will," he said, then added, "You're a guest here. Just remember that." He stayed for another minute, looking around the cabin like he owned the place, then finally headed for the door. "If you need anything, I'll be around," he said, pausing on the porch. "But don't go wandering too far into the woods. It's easy to get lost out there." With that, he walked off, disappearing down the driveway, leaving me standing in the doorway, feeling uneasy. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just a little odd, the kind of guy who spent too much time alone in the woods. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to my book, trying to forget about him. But I couldn't. The way he had walked through the cabin, like he was in control, bothered me more than I wanted to admit. As the sun started to set, the feeling got worse. The cabin felt different, less like a getaway and more like a place I was trapped in. The trees outside the window were thick and dark, and the shadows inside the cabin seemed to stretch farther than they should. I decided to call it a night early, hoping that sleeping would make me feel better in the morning. I locked the front door, checked all the windows, and double-checked the back door, making sure everything was secure. The whole time, I kept thinking about John's warning, about how no one would be around if something happened. I lay in bed for a long time, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was quiet at first, just the wind rustling the leaves, but as the night went on, I started to hear noises. Twigs snapping, the crunch of leaves underfoot, like someone or something was moving around outside. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but every time I started to relax, I'd hear it again, closer this time. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching the cabin. The windows in the bedroom didn't have curtains, and I kept glancing at them, half expecting to see John standing outside, watching me. My heart was racing, and I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard something louder. A thud, like someone knocking on the front door. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. For a second, I thought maybe I had imagined it, but then I heard it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, like someone was testing the door. I stayed still, listening, barely breathing. The knocks came again, louder this time. I didn't know what to do. My phone didn't have service this far out, and there was no landline in the cabin. I was completely cut off. I thought about opening the door, but something in my gut told me not to. It was too late for visitors. Whoever was out there wasn't here for a friendly chat. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. Then I heard footsteps on the porch, slow and heavy, like someone pacing back and forth. I stood up, creeping toward the bedroom door, trying not to make a sound. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. The footsteps moved to the side of the cabin, closer to the bedroom window. I froze, my back pressed against the wall, listening. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing. Then, I heard it breathing. Someone was standing just outside the window, breathing heavily, like they were waiting for me to move. I didn't dare look out the window. I didn't want to know who or what was out there. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Then, without warning, it stopped. The footsteps moved away from the cabin, back toward the front porch. I heard the faint sound of something being placed on the ground, then the footsteps faded into the distance. I waited for what felt like forever before I moved. My hands were shaking as I crept toward the front door, trying to be as quiet as possible. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. Slowly, I unlocked the door and cracked it open, just enough to peek outside. There, on the porch, was a small, folded piece of paper. I hesitated before picking it up, my stomach turning with dread. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, like it had been left out in the sun for too long. I unfolded it, my hands trembling, and read the single line written in shaky handwriting. I told you not to wander too far. I slammed the door shut, locked it again, and backed away, my heart racing. Whoever had left that note had been watching me, maybe for longer than I realized. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the corner of the living room, facing the front door, waiting for the sun to rise. When it finally did, I grabbed my things and left, not bothering to clean up or check out. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see John following me. But the road was empty, and the cabin disappeared from view. I didn't look back. I just kept driving, trying to forget the sound of those footsteps outside my window. I went hiking alone last weekend. I'd rented a small cabin about 2 hours outside of the city. It was one of those off-the-grid types of places, no Wi-Fi, no phone service, just the quiet of the forest. That's what I wanted. I needed some time to myself, away from everything. The cabin was small but comfortable. It had one room with a bed, a little kitchen area, and a wood-burning stove. There was no electricity, just a few lanterns and candles, which suited me fine. I thought it would be peaceful. The hike I planned was a 5-mile loop through the woods and up a ridge. Nothing too intense, just something to get my legs moving and my head clear. I left around mid-morning with a backpack of water, snacks, and a map the cabin's owner had left behind. The weather was perfect, cool but sunny, and the woods were thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. It was quiet, aside from the occasional bird or the crunch of leaves under my boots. I was in my own world, enjoying the silence. It wasn't until I was about an hour into the hike that I first noticed something odd. At first, it was just a feeling like someone was watching me. I brushed it off as paranoia. I was alone in the woods, and sometimes your mind plays tricks on you when it's too quiet. But after a few more minutes, I started to hear things. Twigs snapping, the sound of something moving through the underbrush behind me. I'd stop and listen, but every time I did, the sound would stop too. I told myself it was probably just animals. A deer or maybe a raccoon. But then I noticed something that made my heart sink a little. The trail I was on was narrow, and the ground was soft from recent rain, so my boots left clear prints in the mud. But when I glanced behind me, there were no other footprints. Not even an animal's. The snapping of twigs continued, though, and it was always behind me, just out of sight. I tried to shake it off. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the best of me. I picked up the pace, hoping the faster I walked, the sooner I'd finish the loop and get back to the cabin. But no matter how fast I went, the sounds followed. It was almost like someone or something was keeping pace with me but staying just far enough away that I couldn't see them. About 2 hours into the hike, I reached the top of the ridge. The view was amazing. The forest stretched out for miles, nothing but trees and the blue sky. For a moment, I forgot about the noises, forgot about the weird feeling in my gut. I sat down on a rock to catch my breath and took a sip of water, trying to relax. That's when I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't just a twig snapping. It was a rustling sound, like someone moving through the bushes. I stood up, my heart racing, and looked around. There was no one there. Just the trees, standing still. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it, that same unsettling feeling of being watched. I decided I wasn't going to wait around to find out who or what was following me. I grabbed my backpack and started back down the trail, moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a full run. The whole way down, the sounds kept pace with me, always behind me, never in front. When I finally got back to the cabin, I was drenched in sweat. I hadn't stopped moving for the last 2 hours. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, leaning against it for a moment to catch my breath. I felt safer inside, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. I couldn't shake the thought that someone or something had been following me. I tried to calm myself down, told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I went into the kitchen to get some water, but as soon as I stepped inside, I froze. Something wasn't right. The cabin looked the same, but there were small things that were off. The blanket I had folded on the bed was now draped across the chair. The lantern I had left by the door was now on the windowsill. Little things, but enough to make me panic. I hadn't left the door unlocked when I left for the hike. I was sure of it. But someone had been inside. I could feel it. I grabbed the lantern and my phone, even though there was no service, and sat in the middle of the room, facing the door. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe I had moved the blanket and the lantern and just didn't remember. But that didn't explain the feeling of being followed. The light outside was starting to fade, and the cabin was getting darker. I lit the lantern, hoping the warm light would make me feel safer. But it didn't. If anything, the shadows in the corners of the cabin seemed to grow deeper. I tried to stay calm. I told myself I was just tired from the hike and that nothing was wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A little after sunset, I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like someone dragging their fingers along the side of the cabin. It was faint at first, almost like it was part of the wind. But then it got louder. Closer. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't dare move. I just sat there, gripping the lantern, listening. The scraping stopped for a moment, and then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the cabin. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They were taking their time. I stood up, trying to keep as quiet as possible, and made my way to the window. I peeked out, hoping to see what was out there, but there was nothing. Just darkness and trees. But the footsteps continued. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about going outside, maybe trying to confront whoever was out there, but something told me that was a bad idea. I didn't know what they wanted or how many of them there were. I heard the footsteps stop near the back of the cabin, right where the door was. I held my breath, listening for any movement, but the silence stretched on. I couldn't hear anything. Then, suddenly, there was a knock. 3 slow, heavy knocks on the back door. My stomach dropped, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Whoever it was knew I was inside. They were letting me know they were there. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just stood in the middle of the cabin, gripping the lantern so tightly my knuckles turned white. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Let me in." It was a man's voice, deep and calm, like he was asking for something simple. But there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. "Let me in," he repeated, this time with more insistence. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just stood there, praying he would go away. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I couldn't hear any footsteps, couldn't hear anything at all. It was like the whole forest had gone quiet, waiting. For what felt like hours, I stood there, waiting for him to come back. But he didn't. The only sound was the wind outside, brushing against the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the darkness outside, listening for any signs of movement. But the man never came back. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother to clean up or check out. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. As I drove away from the cabin, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road was empty, and the woods slowly faded into the distance. I don't know who or what was following me in the woods that day, or who had been inside the cabin. But I do know one thing: I'll never go hiking alone again. I rented a cabin in the mountains for a few days to get away from everything. It was in the middle of nowhere, a little wooden place tucked into the trees, with nothing but the sound of the wind in the branches and birds singing in the distance. I needed the quiet. I needed the space. The drive took me almost 6 hours, and by the time I pulled up, the sun was just starting to set. The cabin was simple: 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area. The bathroom was down a short hallway, and there was a wood-burning stove in the corner. It smelled like the place hadn't been lived in for a while, a bit musty, but nothing too bad. There was a stack of wood by the stove, and everything else seemed fine. A bit dusty, maybe, but it wasn't like I was expecting luxury. After unpacking, I made some dinner, sat by the stove, and read a book. It felt good to not hear anything but the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. I turned my phone off for the trip, and there was no Wi-Fi, so it was just me, the book, and the fire. I stayed up a bit late, enjoying the quiet, then headed to bed. I found the journal the next morning. It was tucked under the bed, half hidden under one of the old wooden slats. I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't dropped my phone and bent down to grab it. At first, I thought it was just some old book, but when I opened it, I realized it was a journal. The pages were worn, and some of the ink had faded, but I could still make out most of the writing. It didn't have a name or anything on the cover, just plain brown leather with a few scuffs. It looked like it had been there for a while, but someone had definitely been using it recently. I don't know why I started reading it. I guess I was curious. The first few entries seemed normal enough. Whoever wrote it was just jotting down notes about their stay. Little things, like what they had for breakfast, how quiet the cabin was, how nice the forest looked in the early morning light. They mentioned going for hikes and seeing deer in the woods. Nothing strange. But after a few pages, the tone started to change. The entries got shorter, more rushed. There were mentions of seeing someone in the woods. Just glimpses, they said, like someone was standing between the trees, watching them. They thought it was a hunter or another hiker at first, but no one ever got close. They just stood there, far enough away to be hard to see, but close enough that the writer could feel their eyes on them. I figured it was some kind of story or maybe someone trying to mess with the next guest. I wasn't scared, not yet. But I kept reading. The entries started to get more frantic. Whoever was writing it seemed to be getting paranoid. They said they'd seen the figure closer to the cabin, standing just outside the tree line, always in the same spot, never moving. They tried to approach once, but the figure disappeared into the woods before they could get close. That night, they heard noises outside the cabin, footsteps crunching on the leaves, but when they looked out the window, there was no one there. By this point, I was feeling a little uneasy. The journal didn't seem like a joke anymore. The handwriting was getting messier, shakier. It looked like whoever wrote it had been really scared. I wasn't sure what to think. I mean, it could still have been some kind of prank, but it was unsettling. The last few entries were the worst. They talked about waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone walking around outside. The person writing it said they'd seen the figure standing right at the edge of the porch, just staring at the cabin. They couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape, but they knew it was the same person from the woods. The journal ended abruptly, with one last entry saying they were leaving the next morning. They didn't feel safe anymore. The date on the last entry was the day before I arrived. I put the journal down, feeling a bit on edge. I didn't believe in that kind of stuff, not really, but the fact that it ended so suddenly, the fact that it was dated so close to my stay, it just made my skin crawl a little. I told myself it was just a story, that someone had left it there as a way to freak out the next person. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise from outside made me jump. The wind in the trees, the creak of the cabin settling, the occasional owl hooting in the distance. My mind kept drifting back to the journal, to the figure the writer had mentioned. I kept imagining someone standing just outside, staring at the cabin, watching me. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up in the middle of the night. It was dark, pitch black, except for a sliver of moonlight coming through the window. The cabin was dead silent. I lay there for a few moments, trying to calm down, telling myself it was nothing, just the wind or an animal outside. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching on the leaves outside. They were close, too close. I held my breath, listening, hoping it was just my imagination. But they kept going, circling the cabin, moving from one side to the other. I didn't move. I just lay there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped for a moment, right outside the bedroom window. I didn't dare look. I didn't want to see what was out there. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps started again, moving away from the cabin, back into the woods. I waited, not sure if they were really gone. Eventually, the sounds faded into the distance, and I was left alone in the silence again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, listening, waiting for the footsteps to come back. In the morning, I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I was leaving, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the dirt outside the cabin, clear, human footprints. They circled the cabin, just like I had heard the night before. I didn't stick around to see where they led. I got in my car and drove away, not looking back. I don't know who was out there, watching the cabin. I don't know if it was the same person from the journal, or if it was just some stranger passing through. But I do know one thing, I'm never going back to that cabin again. I moved into the cabin a few months ago. It wasn't anything fancy, just a little place tucked away in the woods, a few miles off the main road. I needed the quiet, the space, after everything that had happened in the city. The cabin wasn't isolated, exactly, there were a few others scattered down the road, but they were far enough away that I felt like I had my own little corner of the world. There was one house about half a mile down the road. It looked old, with chipped paint and a sagging roof, but I never saw anyone there when I first moved in. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the windows were always dark. It didn't bother me. If anything, it made the area feel more private. A few weeks in, though, I started seeing signs that someone was living there. One morning, I noticed a truck in the driveway. It looked old, like it had been sitting for years, but now it was parked neatly, as if someone had moved it recently. A couple of days later, I saw a man outside, cutting the grass with a rusted push mower. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a thick beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. I didn't think much of it at first. People move in and out all the time, and maybe they just hadn't been around when I first got there. But then they started coming by. At first, it was just a man. He stopped by one afternoon while I was working on my garden, introduced himself as Carl, and asked if I needed any help. I told him I was fine, that I had everything under control, and he just kind of stood there for a moment, like he was waiting for me to change my mind. He came back the next day, knocking on my door with a basket of vegetables. "Thought you could use these," he said, holding it out with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I thanked him, took the basket, and tried to make some small talk. He didn't really engage, though, just kept asking me if I was settled in, if I needed anything, if I was ever lonely out here. It wasn't long before his wife showed up. Her name was Linda, and she was quiet, always standing just behind Carl whenever they came by together. She never really spoke, just nodded along to whatever Carl said. They started showing up more often, with little excuses, thought you might want some eggs, or we had some extra firewood. Every time they came by, they stayed a little longer, asking more questions about me, about how long I planned to stay, if I was expecting visitors. It started to get on my nerves, but I didn't want to be rude. They were my only neighbors, and I figured they were just trying to be friendly. But there was something off about the way they lingered, the way they watched me, like they were waiting for something. Then one night, things got worse. I was in bed, just about to fall asleep, when I heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, like the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, but then it got louder. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the side of the cabin. My heart started racing. I thought maybe it was an animal, but the footsteps were too steady for that. I sat up, listening, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom window. I didn't dare move. I just stared at the window, the moonlight casting shadows across the floor, waiting for whatever was out there to leave. And then I saw them. Carl and Linda, standing just outside, staring in through the window. Their faces were blank, expressionless, their eyes fixed on me. They didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, watching. I froze. I didn't know what to do. My phone was on the nightstand, but I didn't want to reach for it, didn't want them to see me move. I thought about calling the police, but what was I going to say? That my neighbors were standing outside, staring at me? It sounded crazy. I stayed still for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, listening, waiting for them to come back. The next morning, I considered leaving, packing up and driving back to the city. But I didn't want to run. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of scaring me away. So I stayed. I told myself it was just a weird moment, that maybe they were looking for something outside and didn't realize I could see them. But things didn't get better. They started coming by more often, sometimes twice a day. They'd knock on my door and wait for me to answer, even when I pretended I wasn't home. I'd look out the window and see them standing there, staring at the door, waiting. When I finally opened it, Carl would smile that same smile, ask the same questions, linger in the doorway like he didn't want to leave. I stopped answering the door. I stopped going outside as much. I even put up curtains to block the windows, but I could still feel their presence. I'd hear footsteps on the porch at night, the sound of someone walking around the cabin. Once, I found muddy footprints leading up to my back door, but when I looked outside, no one was there. Then, one night, I woke up to a noise inside the cabin. I sat up in bed, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the sound of something creaking, like the floorboards were shifting under someone's weight. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it around the room. Nothing. But then I heard it again, coming from the living room. I got out of bed, my hands shaking, and slowly crept down the hallway. The cabin was dark, except for the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. I held my breath, listening, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or the owls settling. But as I reached the living room, I saw it. The front door was open, just a crack, and there, standing in the doorway, was Carl. He was just standing there, staring at me, his hand on the doorknob like he was about to walk inside. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, my voice shaking. Carl didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring, his face blank. After a few moments, he slowly closed the door and walked away, disappearing into the night. I locked the door, checked all the windows, and sat on the couch, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. Calling the police seemed pointless. Carl hadn't done anything illegal, not really, but the way he'd been acting, the way he just stood there in the doorway. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed up my things and called the rental company, telling them I was leaving early. I didn't give them a reason, didn't want to explain what had been happening. I just needed to get out of there. As I was loading my car, I saw Carl and Linda standing in their driveway, watching me. They didn't wave, didn't say anything. They just stood there, staring, until I drove away. I don't know what they wanted, or why they'd been so interested in me. Maybe they were just lonely, maybe they were bored, but something about the way they watched me, the way they showed up at all hours, the way Carl had stood in my doorway in the middle of the night. I've tried to forget about it, tried to move on, but every now and then, I'll catch myself looking out my window, half expecting to see them standing there, watching. I had rented a small cabin in the mountains for a week to get away from everything. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. The cabin was isolated, but not completely remote. There were other cabins scattered around, but none close enough to bother me. I had planned to spend most of my time hiking and enjoying the quiet. The first few days went smoothly. The trails were beautiful, and the solitude was exactly what I needed. I spent hours exploring, taking in the fresh air and the views. It was easy to forget the stress of everyday life. On the fourth day, I decided to take a new trail I had heard about from a local shopkeeper. It was supposed to lead to a great overlook. I packed a small backpack with some water and snacks and set out in the morning. The trail was less traveled than the others, which made it even more appealing. About halfway through the hike, I came across an abandoned backpack lying on the trail. It was old, with frayed edges and dirt taped on the bottom. I stopped and looked around, expecting to see someone coming back to retrieve it, but there was no one in sight. I walked up to it and carefully examined it. It seemed out of place, given the condition of the trail and the fact that it was the only item around. I opened the backpack to see if there was anything useful or identifying inside. There was a flashlight, some granola bars, a couple of water bottles, and a notebook. The notebook was weathered, and the pages were crinkled. I flipped through it but found nothing unusual, just some notes about hiking trails and personal musings. I should have left the backpack where I found it, but curiosity got the better of me. I figured I'd take it back to the cabin, thinking I might find a clue about who it belonged to or if there was a number to call. By the time I made it back to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sky was overcast, and the air was beginning to chill. I approached the cabin and noticed something immediately. There was a note taped to the door. The note was written in messy, block letters. It read, "You're next." My heart sank. I stood there, staring at the note, trying to make sense of it. There was no indication that anyone had been around recently. The cabin looked the same as I had left it. I pulled the note off the door, and as I did, I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned it over to see if there was anything else written on the back, but it was blank. I quickly went inside and locked the door behind me. I double-checked all the windows and made sure everything was secure. I felt a growing sense of dread, realizing that the note could have been meant for me. The backpack and the note seemed connected, but I couldn't figure out how. I tried to stay calm. I made a few phone calls, but there was no signal out here. The only way to reach anyone would be to drive down the mountain, but it was already getting dark. I wasn't sure what to do, so I decided to stay put and keep an eye out. The night was unsettling. I kept checking the windows, listening for any sounds outside. The wind picked up, making eerie noises as it howled through the trees. Every creak and groan of the cabin seemed amplified. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but I could barely focus. Around midnight, I heard a loud thump from outside. It sounded like something heavy had fallen or been dropped. I froze, straining to hear if there were any more noises. After what felt like an eternity, I finally worked up the courage to peek outside. There was nothing but darkness and the occasional rustle of leaves. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, jumping at every little noise. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The note kept replaying in my mind, "You're next." What did it mean? Was someone out there? As soon as it was light, I packed a few things and drove down to the nearest town. I went straight to the sheriff's office and showed them the note and the backpack. The sheriff listened to my story, looked at the note, and said they'd look into it. They seemed concerned, but they didn't have any immediate answers. I returned to the cabin that afternoon, more anxious than before. I kept expecting to see someone lurking around or to find more notes. I checked the area around the cabin for any signs of intrusion but found nothing. The backpack was still in the cabin, and I didn't dare touch it again. That night, I slept fitfully. I kept the lights on and the doors locked, but the unease didn't leave me. The note had made it clear that someone knew I was there, and they had been watching me. I kept wondering if they had followed me back from the trail, if the backpack had been a trap, or if it had been left there deliberately to scare me. The next day, I packed up my things and left the cabin early. I couldn't stay there any longer. I was afraid of what might happen next, of what might be lurking in the shadows. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time, hoping I wouldn't have to come back. The sheriff never found any conclusive evidence or leads on who might have left the note or the backpack. They assured me they were keeping an eye on things, but I never went back to that cabin. The experience left me shaken and wary of ever being alone in the mountains again. I rented a cabin for a week up in the mountains, hoping for a peaceful escape. The cabin was nice, surrounded by dense forest, but it was isolated enough that I felt completely cut off from the outside world. The first few days were great, hiking during the day and relaxing at night. One afternoon, I decided to explore a part of the forest I hadn't seen yet. I had been following a well-marked trail when I noticed a narrow path leading off into the trees. It was unmarked and looked almost hidden. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to follow it, thinking it might lead to some interesting spot or overlook. The trail was overgrown and a bit hard to navigate. It wound through thick brush and the trees seemed to close in around me. I kept pushing forward, telling myself it was just an adventure and I'd head back soon if it didn't look promising. After about an hour, the path suddenly opened up into a small clearing. What I saw there made me stop in my tracks. There was a makeshift camp set up in the middle of this clearing, tents, a small fire pit, and various personal belongings scattered around. It looked like someone had been living here for a while. At first, I thought it might be a group of campers who had set up their base here, but something felt off. The area looked too organized, and the tents were a bit too well worn. I could see some clothing drying on a line and a few metal cans and bottles lying around. I stood at the edge of the clearing, trying to figure out if I should just turn back. But before I could make a decision, I heard voices coming from one of the tents. I took a deep breath and started to turn around, but it was too late. A group of people emerged from the tents. They were dressed in ragged clothes, and their faces were dirty. One of them, a man with a scruffy beard and wild eyes, spotted me right away. He shouted something to the others, and soon the entire group was looking at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something menacing about the way they stared at me. I tried to back away slowly, hoping they'd let me leave without trouble. But as soon as I moved, the man with the scruffy beard started walking towards me. The others followed, closing in on me. I realized then that I was in a precarious situation. "Where do you think you're going?" the man asked, his voice harsh. I tried to explain that I had stumbled upon their camp by accident and that I meant no harm. I told them I was just exploring and wanted to go back to my cabin. The man didn't seem to care about my explanations. He told me firmly that I wasn't welcome there and that I needed to stay. The other people in the camp were nodding and murmuring in agreement. They formed a circle around me, blocking any path I could take to escape. My heart was pounding. I was scared and felt trapped. I looked around for any possible way out, but the dense forest surrounded the clearing on all sides. I had no idea how far I had wandered from the cabin, and I had no idea how to get back without finding the trail again. One of the women in the group, who looked slightly more approachable than the others, came up to me. She told me that they had their reasons for staying hidden and that they didn't take kindly to strangers. She said they'd let me leave, but only if I promised not to tell anyone about what I had seen. I agreed, desperate to get out of there. They seemed to be holding to their word, as they allowed me to leave the clearing. The man with the scruffy beard stayed behind, but he kept a close eye on me as I made my way back. I retraced my steps as best as I could, trying to remember the path I had taken. My fear was overwhelming, and I was anxious the entire time. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. Eventually, I found my way back to the cabin. I was relieved to see it in the distance. Once I got inside, I locked all the doors and windows and took a deep breath. I was safe for now, but the encounter left me shaken. I never spoke to anyone about the camp or what happened that day. I left the cabin a day early, unable to shake the unease and fear. The group in the clearing had made it clear that they did not want to be discovered, and I had no intention of crossing their path again. To this day, I am still haunted by that experience. The fear of stumbling into something dangerous and the feeling of being watched lingered long after I left those mountains. I made sure to stick to well-traveled trails from then on and always paid close attention to where I was going. The encounter served as a stark reminder that not every adventure is as harmless as it seems. I rented a small cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. It was meant to be a peaceful retreat from the hustle and bustle of city life. The cabin was cozy and isolated, nestled deep in the forest. I thought it would be a great place to relax and enjoy some solitude. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, read a bit, and went to bed early. The silence of the forest was calming. The only sounds I heard were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It was exactly what I needed. But then, around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud knocking at the cabin door. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, trying to make sense of the noise. It was persistent, rhythmic, and loud enough to pierce through the quiet of the night. I felt a surge of anxiety. Who could be knocking on my door at this hour? I grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table and quietly got out of bed. My mind was racing with possibilities, but I tried to stay calm. I made my way to the door, the knocking growing louder as I approached. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle. I opened the door slowly, peering into the darkness. There was no one there. I stepped outside and shone the flashlight around, but the area was empty. The only thing I noticed was a set of fresh muddy footprints leading away from the cabin and into the woods. The prints were clear and seemed to have been made recently, given the rain earlier that day. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The footprints led directly from my door into the dense forest, which was now shrouded in darkness. I scanned the area with the flashlight, but I couldn't see anyone or anything. The silence of the forest felt different now, thicker, more oppressive. I considered calling the police, but the nearest town was miles away and I had no cell service. I stood outside for a few more minutes, trying to decide what to do. The knocking had stopped, and the only sound was the occasional crackle of leaves underfoot. I knew I had to go back inside. I didn't want to be outside alone in the dark any longer than necessary. As I closed the door, I made sure to lock it securely. I checked all the windows and doors, ensuring everything was fastened tightly. The cabin had an old lock on the front door that I was sure was sturdy, but after what had happened, I wasn't taking any chances. I tried to settle back into bed, but sleep was elusive. Every little sound seemed amplified, and I kept hearing creaks and groans from the cabin that I hadn't noticed before. My mind was racing, replaying the events over and over. Why had someone come to the door? Who was it, and what did they want? Hours passed, and the fear slowly faded into exhaustion. I finally managed to fall asleep, but it was fitful and restless. I dreamed of shadowy figures and ominous forests. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining and the forest looked much less menacing in the daylight. I decided to investigate the footprints. I followed them into the woods, hoping to find some clue about who had been there and why. The trail led deeper into the forest, winding through trees and underbrush. The tracks were clear, but they eventually led to a point where they simply stopped. There were no signs of anyone or anything beyond that point. I spent a few hours searching the area but found nothing else. It was as if the person who had made the tracks had vanished into thin air. The forest was still and quiet, with only the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though. I returned to the cabin and decided to pack up early. I wasn't comfortable staying another night, and the unsettling feeling had taken away any desire I had to relax. I made sure to check every corner of the cabin and double-check that everything was in order before I left. As I drove away from the cabin, I glanced back at the forest one last time. The tranquil scene was a stark contrast to the terror I had felt the night before. I drove home with a sense of relief, grateful to be back in a place where I felt safe. I never found out who or what had come to my cabin that night. The muddy footprints remained a mystery, and the incident left me shaken. I had always wanted a break from the constant noise of the city, so I rented a small, remote cabin by an old quarry for a week. The place was isolated, with no neighbors around for miles. It seemed perfect for a quiet retreat. I arrived on a sunny afternoon, unpacked my things, and spent the day settling in. The cabin was quaint, with old wooden floors and a big stone fireplace that seemed perfect for cozy nights. The first few nights were peaceful. I spent my evenings reading by the fire and sleeping deeply, lulled by the silence of the surrounding forest. It was everything I had hoped for. However, things started to change on the fourth night. Around midnight, I was woken by a strange sound. It was a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to be coming from outside. I listened carefully and realized it sounded like machinery. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, or perhaps some distant construction, but it felt too close to be that far away. I got up and checked all the windows, but I couldn't see anything unusual. I decided to go back to bed, though the noise kept me awake for the rest of the night. The next night, the noise was back, louder this time. I could hear voices as well, muffled but unmistakable. I felt a growing unease. The cabin was supposed to be far from any kind of community, so where was this sound coming from? I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just some machinery from an old factory or something that I hadn't noticed before. But the voices were unsettling. They had an angry, urgent tone. By the third night of hearing these noises, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight, a knife for protection, and headed out into the darkness. The noises seemed to come from the direction of the quarry, so I made my way cautiously through the dense woods, following the sound. The forest was thick and tangled, and I had to push through branches and brambles. As I got closer, the noise grew louder. The machinery sound was unmistakable now, and I could hear voices more clearly. They were shouting, though I couldn't make out the words. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the edge of the quarry. The moonlight illuminated the old quarry pit, revealing a large, abandoned area that seemed to have been repurposed. What I saw next made my blood run cold. There were lights set up around the quarry, and several trucks were parked there. I could see figures moving about. They were working with large pieces of machinery and seemed to be loading something into the trucks. I couldn't see the details from where I was, but it looked like they were doing something illegal. It wasn't just the machinery and trucks, the whole scene felt off. I turned to leave, but just as I was about to head back, I heard a twig snap behind me. I froze. I slowly turned around, and there, standing a few feet away, were two men. They looked at me with cold, hard expressions. One of them stepped forward and said, "You shouldn't be here." I tried to stay calm, but my mind raced. I turned and started walking back toward the cabin, my heart racing. I could hear the men following me, though they kept their distance. When I reached the cabin, I bolted the door and locked all the windows. I knew I had to get out of there as soon as possible. I called the local police from my cell phone, but of course, there was no signal. I felt trapped. I decided to wait until morning. I spent the night with a knife in my hand, listening to every sound outside. I could still hear occasional noises, but they were fainter. I spent the whole night trying to stay alert and safe. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed my things quickly and prepared to leave. I was terrified and wanted nothing more than to get away from that place. I didn't dare go back to the quarry to see if they were still there. I just drove as fast as I could, my nerves on edge the whole way. When I reached the nearest town, I contacted the police and reported what I had seen. They promised to look into it, but I never followed up to see what they found. I never returned to that cabin or any place similar. The experience left me shaken and wary of isolated places. The fear of what could have happened that night stayed with me long after I had left. I had rented a cabin by a small lake for a week to enjoy some peaceful fishing. The cabin was remote, tucked away in the woods, with no neighbors in sight. It was perfect for getting away from everything. The first few days were exactly what I hoped for. I fished during the day, read books, and relaxed by the fire at night. One afternoon, while I was fishing from the bank, two men approached. They were in their late 30s or early 40s, wearing old fishing vests and hats. They were friendly enough at first. They asked about my setup and seemed genuinely interested in the type of bait I was using and the rod I had. I showed them my gear and answered their questions, though I found their curiosity a bit unusual. They told me they had been fishing further down the lake but decided to come over to see how I was doing. They were polite but overly interested in the specifics of my fishing gear and how I had set up my campsite. After chatting for a while, they left, saying they would see me around. I thought nothing of it and continued fishing, though I felt a little unsettled by their interest. That night, as I was finishing dinner and preparing to head inside, I noticed headlights approaching from the direction of the lake. I went to the window and saw the two men's truck pulling up. I felt a knot in my stomach. It was dark by then, and I wasn't expecting anyone else around. They got out of their truck and started walking towards my cabin. I decided to go outside to see what they wanted. As I stepped out, they greeted me with forced smiles. They said they had come to check out the cabin because they were thinking of renting it in the future. They asked if they could look around, but their manner was different from earlier. It felt off, like they had some other agenda. I was wary but didn't want to be rude. I showed them the cabin's exterior and the area around it, though I kept my distance. They kept making small talk, asking questions about the lake and the surrounding area, but they seemed less interested in the fishing and more interested in the layout of the cabin and the placement of things around the campsite. When they finally left, I made sure to lock up everything and secure the cabin as best as I could. I had a feeling that something wasn't right, but I tried to push it out of my mind. I went to bed, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. In the middle of the night, I was woken by a noise outside. It sounded like someone moving around near my fishing gear. I turned on the light and peered out the window but saw nothing. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went outside to check. The night was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the lake's water. My fishing equipment and camping gear were exactly as I had left them. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been around. I went back inside and double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows, though I had already made sure they were secure. The next morning, I noticed that some of my gear had been moved. The tackle box was in a different spot, and a few items that had been neatly packed were now scattered around. It was clear someone had been in my campsite. I felt a surge of panic. I checked to make sure nothing was missing and found everything accounted for, but the feeling of unease lingered. I packed up my things and decided to leave the cabin a day early. I didn't want to stick around and find out what the men might have been up to. As I was loading my car, I saw their truck parked a little further down the road. I had the unsettling feeling they were watching me from a distance. I made it back home without further incident, but the whole experience left me shaken. I've since avoided renting isolated cabins and always take extra precautions when I'm alone in unfamiliar places.